The wind carried ice and memory across the Colorado hills. Late November 1882 had brought the earliest frost in 7 years, painting the world in shades of white and gray. Malcolm Sullivan's shovel bit into the frozen earth with a sound like breaking bone, each thrust deeper, each pile of dirt higher against the growing mound of snow beside the grave-shaped hole. He didn't wear gloves, never did for this ritual. His hands cracked and bleeding at the knuckles were a necessary penance. The cold had long since numbed them, but he continued to dig with mechanical precision, his breath forming ghosts that dissolved into the twilight. This was the 7th grave he had dug in 7 years, each one empty, each one a marker for someone he couldn't save. 6 mounds already stood in a semicircle on the ridge behind his cabin, crude wooden markers bearing names in both English and Apache. The center grave, the first one, belonged to Ayanna, not her body which had been denied a proper burial, but her memory. Malcolm paused, leaning on the shovel. At 36, his body remained strong, hardened by solitude and physical labor, but something in his chest had grown brittle with each passing winter. The fading light caught the silver streaks in his dark hair and the deep lines etched around his eyes. He wasn't old, but he had lived long enough to accumulate ghosts. Below his cabin stood resolute against the mountainside windows, glowing with firelight, chimney trailing smoke that the wind quickly dispersed. He had built it with his own hands 6 years ago after leaving Fort Richardson, when he decided the company of mountain lions was preferable to that of men. The grave was nearly finished when the first heavy flakes began to fall. The storm that had threatened all day was finally unleashing its fury. Malcolm drove the shovel into the earth one final time before kneeling beside the hole. From inside his coat, he withdrew a small object wrapped in deerskin, a wooden carving of an eagle in flight, which he had spent months shaping from cedar wood. "For Little Hawk," he whispered in Apache, using the name the boy had been given at birth. "May your spirit find the path your body was denied." He placed the carving at the bottom of the empty grave and sat back on his heels. Little Hawk had been only 9 when the soldiers came. The youngest victim of a slaughter Malcolm had been powerless to prevent. The boy's only crime had been running toward Malcolm instead of away when the shooting started, mistaking the translator for a protector. Malcolm began to refill the grave, each shovelful of dirt, a prayer, each stone a remembrance. By the time he finished, the storm had grown fierce, visibility reduced to mere yards. He gathered his tools and made his way down the slope toward the cabin, his shoulders hunched against the driving snow. The interior of the cabin was spare but meticulously organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn furniture. Shelves lined another wall filled with books in multiple languages, jars of dried herbs, and medical supplies, both Western and indigenous in origin. A table beneath the window held mortar and pestle, various plant materials, and small bottles of tinctures Malcolm had prepared. His medical knowledge was an amalgamation of formal training and wisdom gained from Apache healers, knowledge that had once made him valuable to the army, but had not been enough to save those who mattered most. On the wall above his narrow bed hung a painted buffalo hide, Ayanna's creation. The images told the story of her people, and in the corner, hidden unless one knew where to look, was a message in Apache script: "Protect those who survive," a promise he had failed to keep once and which now haunted his solitude. Malcolm stoked the fire and hung his wet coat near the flames. His body ached from the exertion of digging in frozen ground, but the physical discomfort was welcome, a distraction from the memories that always surfaced on these anniversary days. He was preparing a simple meal of rabbit stew when the sound came, so faint against the howling wind that at first he thought he had imagined it. Then it came again, a weak knocking at his door. Malcolm froze, listening. In 6 years, he had received fewer than a dozen visitors. Most of them lost travelers, or occasionally the general store owner from the settlement 12 miles downriver. But never in a storm like this, never at night. The knocking came again, even weaker than before. He crossed to the door, one hand instinctively moving to the revolver holstered at his hip. Caution had kept him alive these past years, but when he swung the door open, the sight before him drove all thoughts of danger from his mind. 5 women stood huddled against the driving snow. They wore tattered dresses beneath threadbare blankets, their feet wrapped in rags, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. But it was their eyes that struck Malcolm most. Dark, wary, fierce, with a determination that had carried them through whatever hell they had escaped. They were Apache. The woman at the front met his gaze without flinching. Blood had frozen in her hair, and a poorly stitched cut ran across her collarbone, visible where her dress had torn. Despite her condition, she stood straight, proud. "We need shelter," she said in English, tinged with the accent of the Southern Apache bands. "Not charity. We work. We earn our place." Behind her, the youngest of the group swayed dangerously. The girl couldn't have been more than 14, her slight frame trembling violently, her lips blue with cold. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said simply. They entered one by one, moving cautiously, watching him as they passed. The oldest woman, gray-streaked hair and face lined with decades of hardship, nodded once in acknowledgement but did not thank him. The smell of wood smoke, blood, and pine sap clung to their clothing. The youngest girl stumbled as she crossed the threshold, and Malcolm instinctively reached out to steady her. She flinched away from his touch, fear flashing across her features before she regained her balance and moved quickly toward the fire where the others had gathered. "I have stew," Malcolm said, moving to the hearth and ladling the hot liquid into bowls. "It's not much, but it's warm." He distributed the food without comment, then stepped back, giving them space. The women ate with controlled urgency, the practiced restraint of those who had known true hunger but retained their dignity. The leader, the one who had spoken, kept her eyes on Malcolm as she ate. She was evaluating him, measuring the threat he might pose. He recognized the look. He had worn it himself many times. "I'm Malcolm Sullivan," he offered, keeping his voice neutral. She took another spoonful of stew before responding. "Ruby," she said finally, then gesturing to each woman in turn. "Pahana, Miki, Istas. The young one is Dolly." Dolly had barely touched her food. She sat closest to the fire, but her shivering had not subsided. Up close, Malcolm could see the unhealthy flush on her cheeks, the glassy look in her eyes. "She's feverish," he said, moving toward his shelf of medicines. Ruby tensed. "She'll be fine." "She won't," Malcolm countered flatly. "That's mountain fever starting. Without treatment, she'll be dead by morning." The oldest woman, Pahana, spoke rapidly in Apache to Ruby, who responded in kind. Malcolm kept his face impassive, giving no indication that he understood every word they exchanged. "He might poison her," Pahana had warned. "If he wanted us dead, he could have left us outside," Ruby had replied. Malcolm selected several jars from his shelf, bringing them to the table. "I need to examine her," he said to Ruby. "The choice is yours, but I've seen this before. It moves quickly." After a long moment, Ruby nodded. Istas helped Dolly to the table. The quiet woman named Istas, middle-aged with watchful eyes, helped Dolly to her feet. The girl could barely stand, her legs buckling, as they guided her to the chair Malcolm had pulled out. Up close, Dolly's condition was worse than he had initially assessed. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her skin burning with fever. When he gently examined her wrapped feet, he found severe frostbite, beginning the flesh mottled and swollen. "How long have you been traveling?" he asked, not looking up from his examination. 5 days, Ruby answered after a pause. "Through the pass." Malcolm's hand stilled for a moment. 5 days on foot through mountain terrain in winter conditions. It was nearly impossible. Whatever they were running from, it had to be worse than the almost certain death of such a journey. "She needs medicine," he said, "and a ritual." Ruby's eyes narrowed. "What do you know of our rituals, white man?" Instead of answering, Malcolm turned to his shelf and retrieved a small drum and a pouch of sacred herbs used in Apache healing ceremonies. The presence of these items clearly surprised the women's suspicion, mingling with curiosity in their expressions. Malcolm began preparing a mixture of willowbark, elderberry, and herbs known to the Apache as fever breakers. As he worked, he spoke quietly, his words directed at Dolly, but meant for all of them. "There was an old medicine woman near Fort Richardson who taught me. She said sickness enters through pathways in the body, and healing must follow those same paths to drive it out." He added water to the mixture, heating it over the fire. The aroma of medicinal herbs filled the cabin. Then, to their visible shock, Malcolm began to sing softly in perfect Apache, a healing song so old and sacred that few outside the tribe had ever heard it, much less learned to perform it correctly. The song's rhythm matched the beating of his small drum, the words calling on ancestral spirits to strengthen the sick and guide them back to health. He continued the ritual while preparing a poultice for Dolly's frostbitten feet, his movements confident and reverent. Ruby and the others watched in stunned silence. White men didn't know these songs. They didn't respect these ways. Yet here was this solitary cabin dweller performing a complex healing ritual with the precision of a tribal healer. As Malcolm worked, his attention focused entirely on saving the girl, he didn't notice how intently Ruby studied his face, recognition slowly dawning in her eyes. He finished preparing the medicine and approached Dolly with a cup of the steaming liquid. "Drink," he instructed gently. "All of it." The girl's eyes flickered to Ruby, who nodded permission. Dolly took the cup with trembling hands and sipped the bitter liquid, grimacing but continuing until it was gone. Malcolm then knelt to treat her feet, carefully applying the poultice and wrapping them in clean cloth. As he secured the bandage, his hand brushed against something around Dolly's neck, a leather cord that had been hidden beneath her dress. He caught a glimpse of what hung from the curtain, a small stone amulet intricately carved with the symbols representing protection and strength. Malcolm's hands froze, his breath catching in his throat. He knew that amulet. He had carved it himself 7 years ago as a gift for Ayana when she told him she was carrying his child, a child he believed had died alongside its mother in the massacre at Snake Creek. Malcolm looked up sharply, truly seeing Dolly's face for the first time. The high cheekbones, the particular set of her eyes, features that mirrored Ayana's, but with something of himself as well. How had he not noticed immediately the girl was watching him with fevered confusion, unaware of the revelation that had just struck him? Malcolm carefully tucked the amulet back beneath her dress, his fingers trembling slightly as he completed the task. "Rest now," he said, his voice rougher than before. "The medicine will help." He rose and stepped back, finding Ruby's gaze fixed on him with new intensity. Did she know? Had she brought Dolly here deliberately, or was this an impossible coincidence? Malcolm turned away, busying himself with cleaning his supplies, using the mundane task to regain his composure. His mind raced with questions with implications. If Dolly was his daughter, Ayana's daughter, how had she survived? Who had raised her, and why, after 7 years, had they appeared at his door on this of all nights? "She needs to sleep near the fire," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "The warmth will help the medicine work." Istas and Mickey, the youngest of the adult women who had remained silent throughout, prepared a place for Dolly near the hearth using the extra blankets Malcolm provided. The girl was already growing drowsy from the medicine, her eyelids heavy. "You should all rest," Malcolm said, avoiding Ruby's searching gaze. "The storm won't pass before morning. We'll talk then." The women arranged themselves around the cabin, Pahana nearest the door like a guardian, Istas and Mickey close to Dolly Ruby, positioned where she could see both the girl and Malcolm. None of them fully relaxed, maintaining the vigilance of those accustomed to danger. Malcolm settled into his chair by the window, rifle across his lap, ostensibly watching the storm outside. But his attention was repeatedly drawn to Dolly's sleeping form, to the daughter he had never known existed. If she was his child, and the amulet suggested she must be, then everything changed. The empty grave he had just completed on the ridge seemed a cruel mockery now. While he had been performing rituals for the dead, one of them had been alive all along. Through the night, Malcolm tended the fire and checked on Dolly, periodically replacing the cool cloth on her forehead when fever threatened to spike. Each time he approached, Ruby's eyes followed him, watchful, evaluating. Near dawn, when the others had finally succumbed to exhaustion, Ruby spoke. "You recognize her?" she said softly, not a question but a statement. Malcolm met her gaze steadily. "Should I?" Ruby's expression remained unreadable. "Perhaps, perhaps not." "Who are you running from?" Malcolm asked, changing the subject. A humorless smile touched Ruby's lips. "Who says we're running? 5 days through mountain passes in winter, frostbite, exhaustion, no supplies." Malcolm shook his head. "People don't endure that without reason." Ruby was silent for a long moment, watching him. Finally she said, "The Army has renewed interest in certain Apache bands, those with specific knowledge." "What knowledge?" But Ruby had said all she intended to. She turned away, ending the conversation as definitively as if she had walked from the room. Malcolm didn't press. He understood secrets, understood the need to protect information. Whatever had driven these women to his cabin, they would reveal it in their own time, or not at all. Outside, the storm began to abate, the wind's howl softening to a mournful keen. First light seeped through the cabin windows, gray and diffuse. A new day was beginning, bringing with it complications Malcolm could never have anticipated when he had risen yesterday to dig a grave for a ghost. By mid-morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world transformed beneath a blanket of pristine snow. Inside the cabin, Dolly's fever had broken, though she remained weak and disoriented. The other women moved with purpose, their initial wariness giving way to the practical necessities of survival. Pahana had taken charge of the cooking, preparing a simple porridge from Malcolm's stores. Istas cleaned and repaired tears in their clothing with needle and thread borrowed from Malcolm's supplies. Mickey, the quietest of the group, had ventured outside briefly to gather snow for melting into drinking water. Malcolm split wood behind the cabin, the physical exertion helping to clear his mind. The rhythmic swing of the axe, the satisfying crack as each log split. These were constants in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. Ruby approached, her footsteps nearly silent in the snow. She stood watching him for a moment before speaking. "Your medicine helped her." Malcolm nodded, setting another log on the stump. "The fever's broken. Her feet will take longer to heal." "Where did you learn our ways?" Ruby asked directly. Malcolm brought the axe down cleanly, splitting the log. "I told you, a medicine woman near Fort Richardson. Our healers don't share such knowledge with white men." He paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Some do when they believe it will preserve their wisdom rather than destroy it. Ruby's eyes narrowed slightly. You speak our language. It wasn't a question, but Malcolm answered anyway. I was a translator for the Army, Apache, Navajo, Comanche, Spanish. He set up another log. It was my job to understand. Understanding is not the same as respecting. Malcolm met her gaze. No, it's not. He swung the axe again, ending the conversation. Ruby remained for a moment longer, then returned to the cabin, leaving Malcolm alone with his thoughts and the steady rhythm of his work. Inside, he found Dolly awake and sitting up wrapped in blankets near the fire. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, followed him as he entered carrying an armload of split wood. How are you feeling? He asked, stacking the logs beside the fireplace. Dolly glanced at Ruby before answering. Better, she said softly. Her voice was melodic, even in that single word reminiscent of Ayanna's. Malcolm nodded, careful not to stare at her, though every fiber of his being wanted to search her features for further confirmation of what he already suspected. Good. You need to keep drinking the medicine. And stay off those feet for a few more days. We can't stay that long, Ayanna interjected from across the room. You can barely walk, Malcolm replied, addressing Dolly directly. And the snow is waist-deep in places. You won't make it a mile. Ruby stepped forward. We'll earn our keep, all of us. But Pahana is right. We can't stay long. Why? Malcolm asked simply. The women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Mickey who finally spoke, her voice surprisingly strong for someone who had been so quiet. Because they'll follow our trail once the snow settles. They always do. Malcolm considered this. Who are they? Again, that silent communication. Ruby made a small gesture and Mickey fell silent. It doesn't matter, Ruby said. What matters is that we'll be moving on as soon as Dolly can travel. Malcolm didn't argue. Instead, he turned his attention to practical matters. The path down to Silverton will be blocked for at least a week. I have supplies enough for all of us until then if we're careful. He began distributing tasks, ways they could contribute as they had insisted. Ruby would help with hunting Pahana with food preparation, Istis with mending and repairs, Mickey with tending the animals in his small stable. Dolly would rest and heal. As the day progressed, Malcolm observed the women carefully. They worked with the efficiency of those long accustomed to hardship, wasting no movement, conserving energy. But there were moments, small gestures, exchanged glances, that revealed they were more than simply survivors thrown together by circumstance. They functioned as a unit, protecting one another, particularly Dolly. By evening, the cabin had transformed. The women's presence had filled the space that had for so long held only Malcolm and his ghosts. The sound of quiet conversation in a mix of Apache and English, the smell of cooking food, the simple human noises of people moving about, all served to emphasize how profound his isolation had been. After the evening meal, Malcolm checked Dolly's feet again, replacing the poultice and rewrapping the bandages. As he worked, he spoke to her gently. The amulet you wear, he said, keeping his voice casual. It's beautiful craftsmanship. Dolly's hand moved instinctively to her chest where the amulet lay hidden beneath her dress. It was my mother's, she said softly. She must have been important to you. Dolly nodded, her expression solemn beyond her years. I never knew her. She died when I was born. Malcolm's hand stilled momentarily. I'm sorry. Ruby says she was brave. Dolly continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She died helping others escape. Each word was a knife twisting in Malcolm's chest. He finished wrapping her feet in silence, his mind racing with implications. If Ayanna had died in childbirth or shortly after that, meant she had survived the initial attack at Snake Creek, survived long enough to give birth to their child, to pass on the amulet he had carved. Why had he never known? Why had he been told everyone was killed? There, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. Keep them elevated when you can. Dolly thanked him quietly, her eyes studying his face with a curiosity that made him wonder what stories she had been told about her father, if she had been told anything at all. Later that night, after the women had settled for sleep, Malcolm stepped outside onto the porch. The night was clear and bitterly cold, stars sharp as glass shards against the black sky. The graves on the ridge were visible as dark mounds against the snow-silent sentinels overlooking the cabin. He heard the door open behind him, but didn't turn. Ruby's footsteps approached, stopping a few feet away. She's yours, Ruby said without preamble. Ayanna's daughter, your daughter. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, the confirmation both a wound and a balm. How did she survive? Ayanna escaped the initial attack. She was already heavy with child, made it to our village before giving birth. Ruby's voice was flat, emotionless. She died 3 days later from her wounds. And you raised her. We all did. What was left of our band? Malcolm turned to face her. Why bring her here now? After 7 years. Ruby's eyes reflected the starlight, hard as obsidian. I didn't know this was your cabin until I saw you. The healer at Fort Defiance said there was a man in the high country who could help. A man who knew both white medicine and our ways. I didn't know it was you. You recognized me, though, Malcolm said, when I performed the healing ritual. A small, bitter smile touched Ruby's lips. Before that, Ayanna described you well, the translator who spoke with the forked tongue. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Is that what she thought, that I betrayed them? Didn't you, boy? Ruby's voice hardened. You were there when they came. You were supposed to warn them. I tried, Malcolm said, the old guilt rising like bile. Captain Fletcher knocked me unconscious when he realized what I was doing. When I came to, it was too late. Ruby studied him, searching for truth or lies in his expression. Ayanna believed you set them up, that you led the soldiers to them. Never, Malcolm whispered, the word torn from him. I loved her. I would have died to protect her, to protect all of them. Pretty words, Ruby said, but some of the hardness had left her voice. Dolly doesn't know about you. Ayanna never told anyone who the father was, not even me. I guess from how she spoke of you before she believed you betrayed them. Malcolm looked toward the ridge, toward the empty grave he had dug for Little Hawk, toward the central mound that marked Ayanna's memory. All these years I thought she died hating me for something I didn't do. Perhaps she did, Ruby said bluntly. Does it matter now? It matters, Malcolm said quietly, but not as much as Dolly. Ruby followed his gaze to the ridge. The graves, you dug them. One each year, for those I couldn't save. Something in Ruby's expression shifted, not softening exactly, but a recognition of shared grief. Our ways say the dead should be honored, but not bound to this world through excessive mourning. I wasn't raised in your ways, Malcolm replied. No, Ruby agreed, but you've learned enough of them to heal my niece. She turned to go back inside, pausing at the door. We'll leave as soon as she can travel. Whether you tell her who you are before then is your choice. But understand this, she has survived this long without a father. She doesn't need one now. With that, Ruby disappeared into the cabin, leaving Malcolm alone with the stars and the weight of a truth that changed everything, yet resolved nothing. Dawn brought clear skies and bitter cold. Malcolm rose early, checking on Dolly before heading out to tend to his animals and assess the conditions. The snow had drifted in places to heights greater than a man, effectively cutting off the cabin from the lower valley. They were isolated, at least for now. Inside, the women were already awake and moving about their self-assigned tasks. There was a new tension in the air, the revelation of Dolly's parentage creating undercurrents that swirled beneath the surface of mundane activities. Malcolm avoided Ruby's gaze as he entered, focusing instead on Dolly, who sat mending a tear in her dress, with surprising skill for one so young. How are the feet this morning? He asked, kneeling beside her. Better, she replied, looking up from her work. Still painful, but I can wiggle my toes now. Malcolm nodded, encouraged by this sign. That's good. We'll change the poultice again later. He hesitated, then added, I thought I might show you how to make the medicine yourself. It's knowledge that could serve you well. Dolly's eyes brightened with interest. Ruby says knowledge is the one thing no one can take from you. Ruby is wise, Malcolm said, meaning it despite the complicated feelings he harbored toward the woman who had raised his daughter. Across the room, Istis was examining the painted buffalo hide on Malcolm's wall, her fingers hovering just above the surface without touching it. Her expression was one of deep concentration, as if she were reading something written there. Did you make this? She asked without turning. No, Malcolm answered. It was a gift from someone important to me. Istis nodded, still studying the hide. The symbols at the edge, they're old, from before the reservations, protection symbols. Malcolm had never noticed these details, had always focused on the central imagery that told Ayanna's tribal history. I didn't know, he admitted. Few would recognize them now, Istis said. They're from a time when our people could still move freely, when the old knowledge wasn't yet lost. There was something in her tone, a significance beyond mere observation. Malcolm sensed she was telling him something important, though he couldn't yet grasp what it was. The day passed in a rhythm of work and rest. Malcolm showed Dolly how to prepare various medicines, explaining the properties of each herb and root. She proved an apt pupil, her questions revealing a sharp intelligence and genuine curiosity. How did you learn all this? She asked as they worked. Malcolm measured his words carefully. I was stationed at several forts as a translator. During that time, I met healers from different tribes who were willing to share their knowledge. One in particular, a woman named Nahimana, taught me the most. Why would she teach a white man? Dolly's question was direct without accusation. She said knowledge doesn't belong to any one people. Malcolm replied, remembering the old woman's wizened face and sharp eyes. She believed that sharing it was how it survived, even as everything else was taken away. Dolly considered this. Were you a good soldier? The question caught Malcolm off guard. I was never really a soldier. I was a translator, a go-between. But you worked for them, the ones who hunted us. Malcolm set down the mortar and pestle he had been using. Yes, he said honestly, until I couldn't anymore. Until I saw too much. Dolly's gaze was direct, piercing in its intensity. What did you see? Injustice, Malcolm said simply. Cruelty disguised as progress. I thought I could help by being a voice for your people, by making sure they were understood. But understanding wasn't what the army wanted. They wanted compliance or elimination. So you left? Yes. And came here alone? Malcolm nodded. It seemed fitting. Dolly was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she asked, do you ever miss people, having them around? The question struck at the heart of Malcolm's self-imposed isolation, the punishment he had chosen for his failures. Sometimes, he admitted, but mostly I found peace in solitude. Until we came, Dolly said, a hint of apology in her voice. Malcolm looked at her, this child who was his blood, who carried Ayanna's spirit in his own features in subtle ways he was beginning to recognize. Your arrival has been unexpected, but not unwelcome. Dolly smiled, then a small, tentative expression that transformed her solemn face. In that moment, she looked so much like her mother that Malcolm had to look away, his chest tight with emotions he had long suppressed. Outside, Ruby and Pahana returned from checking snares Malcolm had set earlier. They carried 2 rabbits, enough to supplement their evening meal. As they entered, stamping snow from their boots, Malcolm noticed Ruby watching the interaction between him and Dolly, her expression guarded. That evening, as they gathered around the fire after the meal, Pahana began to sing softly, an old Apache song about the stars finding their places in the night sky. Her voice, weathered but strong, filled the cabin with a beauty that transcended language. One by one, the other women joined in, even Dolly adding her clear, youthful notes to the harmony. The song spoke of ancestors watching from above, of guidance in darkness, of the eternal cycle of the people. Malcolm sat apart listening. Though he understood the words, he felt keenly his position as outsider, connected to these women through Dolly's blood, through shared knowledge of their ways, yet fundamentally separate. As the song ended, Istas rose and approached the wall where the painted hide hung. Without asking permission, she removed it carefully and brought it to the center of the room, spreading it on the floor before the fire. This tells a story, she said, looking at Malcolm. Not just the one painted here, but in the way it was made, in the symbols hidden at the edges. Malcolm leaned forward, curious despite himself. Istas pointed to tiny markings he had never noticed, symbols nearly invisible unless one knew to look for them. These speak of water in the desert, of finding life where others see only death. Ruby and Pahana exchanged sharp glances, and Mickey's hand moved instinctively to a pouch she wore at her waist. What are you saying? Malcolm asked, aware that something significant was happening, something beyond his understanding. Istas looked to Ruby, who gave a slight nod of permission. The one who made this, Istas continued, knew the old ways, the ways of finding water in barren lands. It is why we were attacked, why we are still hunted. Malcolm's gaze moved to Ruby. You said the army had renewed interest in certain Apache bands, those with specific knowledge. Ruby's expression was grim. The drought has lasted 3 summers now. Cattle die, crops fail, mines close because there isn't enough water to process ore. The army has decided our knowledge is no longer superstition. It's a resource to be extracted. Like gold, Pahana added bitterly, like silver, like everything else they take. Malcolm looked down at the hide, at Ayanna's creation, seeing it with new eyes. Ayanna knew this water-finding knowledge. She was learning, Ruby said, from our grandmother. But Mickey was the true student. She carries the full knowledge now. Mickey's hand tightened on the pouch at her waist. She was younger than the others, except Dolly perhaps, in her mid-20s, with a quietness that Malcolm had mistaken for shyness, but now recognized as the stillness of deep connection to the land. This is why Fletcher attacked the village at Snake Creek, Malcolm said, understanding dawning. Not because of supposed horse thefts or border violations, but because of this knowledge. Ruby nodded. They wanted guides who could lead them to water sources. When our people refused, she didn't need to finish. Malcolm knew all too well what happened when indigenous people refused the army's demands. And now they're after you for the same reason, he concluded. The drought is worse. Mickey spoke up, her voice soft but clear, the desperation greater. They sent men to our new settlement 2 weeks ago demanding guides. When we refused, they took hostages. We freed them, Ruby said flatly. There were casualties. Malcolm understood immediately. You killed soldiers. They were not soldiers, Pihana corrected sharply. They wore no uniforms. They came in the night like cowards. But they were sent by the army to you, Malcolm pressed. Ruby's expression was stone. By one man, a colonel who has decided our knowledge is worth any price. A cold feeling settled in Malcolm's stomach. Do you know his name? Blackwood, Mickey said. Colonel Vernon Blackwood. The name hit Malcolm like a physical blow. Blackwood had been Fletcher's superior, the man who had given the order to pacify the Snake Creek settlement. Malcolm had never met him directly, but his reputation for ruthless efficiency was well known. If Blackwood is involved, Malcolm said slowly, then you're right to run. He doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. We're not running, Ruby countered. We're protecting the knowledge. If Mickey is captured, if she breaks under their methods, they will gain power over all water in the territory. Our people, the settlers, everyone would be at their mercy. Malcolm looked at each woman in turn, understanding now the weight they carried. This wasn't just about their survival. It was about preserving a balance of power, about keeping sacred knowledge from becoming a weapon. His gaze came to rest on Dolly, who had been listening intently to the entire exchange. She was part of this struggle by birth, by the blood that ran in her veins, both Apache and his own. The storm has bought you time, he said finally. The snow will cover your tracks, and no one can navigate the high passes for at least a week. But once the weather breaks, we'll be gone before then, Ruby assured him. Malcolm shook his head. Dolly can't travel yet, and even when she can, where will you go? Blackwood will have men watching every Apache settlement, every reservation. We have a place, Pahana said, far from here, where the old ways are still honored. Malcolm didn't press for details. The less he knew, the less he could reveal if questioned. But a new worry had taken root. The realization that when these women left, they would take Dolly with them. His daughter, whom he had just discovered, would disappear from his life as suddenly as she had entered it. The thought was like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold. Yet what claim did he have on her, what right to disrupt the family she had known all her life? You should rest, he said, rising. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. As the women prepared for sleep, arranging their bedrolls around the fire, Malcolm stepped outside once more. The night was crystal clear, stars blazing with impossible brightness in the mountain air. His breath frosted immediately, hanging in the stillness before dissipating. He looked toward the ridge, toward the 7 graves silhouetted against the starlit snow. He had spent years mourning, years atoning for failures, both real and imagined. Now fate or coincidence had delivered his daughter to his door, along with knowledge that could change the balance of power in the territory. What was he to do with these gifts, these responsibilities? The solitude he had cultivated had been a form of penance, but it had also been a retreat from difficult choices. Now choices loomed before him once more. Choices with consequences that would ripple far beyond his isolated cabin. Malcolm stood in the cold until his fingers grew numb, until the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of hours. When he finally returned inside the cabin, was quiet, the women asleep. All except Ruby, who sat by the fire, watchful as ever. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them. They were bound now not by choice, but by circumstance, by shared history, by Dolly's existence. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Not as friends, perhaps, but as reluctant allies in a struggle larger than their personal grievances. Malcolm nodded once in acknowledgement, and Ruby returned the gesture before turning her gaze back to the fire. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it the promise of another storm. 3 days passed in relative peace. The women settled into a routine around the cabin, each contributing according to her abilities. Dolly's condition improved steadily under Malcolm's care, the fever completely gone, her feet healing well enough that she could stand for short periods. Malcolm spent increasing time with her, teaching her not only about medicine, but also showing her how to read from the books on his shelves, sharing knowledge that bridged their two worlds. He did not tell her he was her father, honoring Ruby's implicit warning, but he treasured each moment nonetheless. Istus had begun drawing symbols around the cabin, small, nearly invisible markings at windows and doorways. When Malcolm questioned her about them, she simply said, "Protection, the old ways." He didn't press further, recognizing the sacred nature of what she was doing, but he noted how Pahana and Ruby approved how they seemed to take comfort in these ancient sigils. On the morning of the 4th day, Malcolm rose before dawn and ventured out to check his trapline. The snow had settled enough to make travel possible, though still challenging. He needed to assess conditions in the wider area to determine how much time remained before the passes would be navigable again. The forest was silent, draped in white, the world reduced to stark contrasts of shadow and light. Malcolm moved through it with practiced ease, reading the subtle signs of animal movement, noting how the snow was already beginning to compact beneath its own weight. He was checking his third trap when he heard it, the distant jingle of harness bells. Someone was on the trail below, heading toward his cabin. Malcolm abandoned the trap line and moved quickly to a ridge overlooking the lower valley. Concealed among the pines, he watched as a lone rider made slow progress along the partially cleared path. The man wore a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat crusted with snow, a rifle slung across his back. At his hip was the unmistakable glint of a sheriff's badge. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Law enforcement rarely ventured this far into the high country, especially in winter. This was no coincidence. He circled back toward the cabin, moving faster now, taking a route that would bring him there ahead of the rider. When he burst through the door, the women looked up in alarm from their various tasks. "Someone's coming," Malcolm said with a preamble. "A sheriff or deputy, still about half an hour out." Ruby immediately began gathering their few possessions. "We need to leave." "There's no time," Malcolm countered. "He'll see your tracks in the snow, and Dolly can't travel fast enough." "Then what do you suggest?" Pahana demanded. Malcolm thought quickly. "Hide in the root cellar. There's access from inside behind the pantry shelf. It's small, but it will fit all of you." Mickey shook her head. "If he searches, he won't," Malcolm assured her. "Not if I handle this right. I know how these men think." Ruby hesitated, clearly torn between flight and trust. Finally, she nodded. "Show us." Malcolm moved the heavy shelf aside, revealing a trapdoor set into the floor. Below was a small space dug into the earth where he stored vegetables and preserves through the winter. It would be cramped for 5 people, but it would conceal them. The women descended quickly, Dolly helped by Estes and Mickey. As Ruby prepared to follow, Malcolm caught her arm. "Whatever happens, stay quiet," he instructed. "No matter what you hear." Ruby searched his face, then nodded once before disappearing into the cellar. Malcolm replaced the shelf, arranging items to appear undisturbed, then quickly removed all signs of the women's presence. Extra bowls, clothing, bedrolls. He had just stoked the fire when the sound of hooves reached his ears. Taking a deep breath, Malcolm opened the door and stepped onto the porch, one hand resting near but not on his holstered revolver. The rider drew up before the cabin, his horse blowing clouds of steam in the cold air. Now that he was closer, Malcolm could see he was middle-aged, his beard streaked with gray beneath a weathered face. The badge on his coat identified him as Sheriff Boyd Hollister from the settlement at Wolf Creek, some 30 miles distant. "Morning," Hollister called, remaining mounted. "Sorry to disturb. Boyd Hollister, Wolf Creek Sheriff." "Malcolm Sullivan," Malcolm replied evenly. "What brings you up this way?" "Sheriff Long ride in tough conditions." Hollister dismounted stiffly, leading his horse to the hitching post. "Official business, I'm afraid. Mind if I warm up a bit before we talk?" Malcolm gestured toward the door. "Coffee's hot." Inside, Hollister removed his gloves and hat, warming his hands by the fire while Malcolm poured coffee into 2 tin cups. The sheriff's eyes moved around the cabin, taking in details with professional assessment. "Quite a setup you've got here," he commented. "Most solitary types I know aren't so organized." Malcolm handed him a cup. "I like order." Hollister nodded, sipping the hot liquid gratefully. "Been up here long. 6 years. Army before that, I'd guess. You've got the look." Malcolm kept his expression neutral. "Translator, not a soldier." "Ah." Hollister seemed to file this information away. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, I'll get to the point. I'm looking for a group of Apache women who might have come through this area, 5 of them, including a young girl." "Apache?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow as if surprised. "Haven't seen any Apache in these parts for years. Nearest reservation's 100 miles south." Hollister studied him over the rim of his cup. "These wouldn't be reservation Apache. They're fugitives. Killed 2 men near Black Mesa last week. Government contractors." "Sorry to hear that," Malcolm said. "But as you can see, I'm alone here. Haven't had visitors since before the first snow." Hollister set his cup down and reached inside his coat, withdrawing a folded paper. He opened it, revealing a crude sketch of a woman with a description beneath. The face was unmistakably Ruby's. "This one's the ringleader," Hollister said. "Ruby Stoneheart. Dangerous woman. The reward's substantial. $500 for information leading to her capture." Malcolm examined the paper with what he hoped was detached curiosity. What did these government contractors want with Apache women? A flicker of something, discomfort perhaps, crossed Hollister's face. "Above my pay grade, Mr. Sullivan. I just enforce the law." "Of course," Malcolm said, handing the paper back. "Well, I wish I could help, both with your search and with the reward, but like I said, I haven't seen anyone." Hollister refolded the paper, tucking it away. "Mind if I look around outside standard procedure?" Need to be thorough in my report. Help yourself, Malcolm said, gesturing toward the door. Though there's not much to see besides snow. As Hollister moved toward the exit, he paused, turning back. One more thing. These women, they're believed to be carrying certain tribal artifacts, items of significant value to the government. If you should encounter them or find anything they might have left behind, it would be considered your duty to report it. Malcolm nodded. I understand duty, Sheriff. Hollister held his gaze for a moment longer, then stepped outside. Through the window, Malcolm watched as the sheriff circled the cabin, examining the area, occasionally kneeling to study something in the snow. After what seemed an eternity, Hollister returned to his horse, adjusted his saddle, and remounted. Malcolm stepped onto the porch. Find anything of interest? He called. Hollister settled into his saddle. Plenty of tracks. All look like yours, though. Must do a lot of walking around your property. Wood doesn't chop itself, Malcolm replied with a shrug. The sheriff nodded, gathering his reins. Well, thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Sullivan. If you do happen to see anything unusual, Wolf Creek's a 2-day ride south once the lower pass clears. I'll keep that in mind. Hollister tipped his hat and turned his horse, but paused after a few steps. Without looking back, he said, Be careful up here alone, Sullivan. Weather's not the only danger in these mountains. With that cryptic warning, he urged his horse forward, soon disappearing among the trees on the trail leading down toward the valley. Malcolm remained on the porch long after Hollister had gone, watching and listening to ensure the sheriff hadn't doubled back. When he was certain the man was truly gone, he returned inside and moved the shelf aside, opening the trapdoor. The women emerged one by one, stiff from the cramped space. Ruby was last, her expression taut with tension. He's gone, Malcolm assured them. For now, Ruby said grimly, but he'll be back with others. Malcolm nodded, pouring coffee for them soon. He knows you're in the area. The tracks outside, I couldn't erase all of them before he arrived. Pahana cursed softly in Apache. Did he recognize them as ours? I don't think so, but he's suspicious. And he mentioned specifically that you might be carrying tribal artifacts of value to the government. Mickey's hand moved to the pouch at her waist. The water maps. That must be it, Malcolm agreed. He also said the reward for Ruby is $500. That's a fortune in these parts. Every bounty hunter for 100 miles will be looking for you once word spreads. Ruby paced the small cabin, thinking, We need to leave. Tonight. That would be a mistake, Malcolm countered. Hollister will be watching the trails, and Dolly still can't travel at full speed. We can't stay here, Ruby insisted. We've put you at risk already. Malcolm looked at each of them in turn, his decision already made, though he had only just realized it. I'm coming with you. The declaration was met with surprised silence. Why would you do that? Pahana asked, suspicious. Malcolm chose his words carefully, aware of Dolly listening. Because what you're protecting matters. Because Blackwood and men like him have taken enough, and because, he hesitated, then finished simply, because it's the right thing to do. Ruby studied him, searching for hidden motives. The journey won't be easy. We're heading into territory few white men have seen. I'm not asking where we're going, Malcolm said. That's your secret to keep. But I know these mountains better than anyone. I can get you through passes that don't appear on any map. And I can fight if it comes to that. A long moment of silence followed as the women communicated in glances and subtle gestures. Finally, Ruby nodded. We leave at nightfall, she said. Pack only what's essential. As the women prepared, Malcolm took stock of his supplies, selecting carefully what to bring and what to leave behind. Weapons, ammunition, medicine, food that would travel well. The essentials of survival in harsh conditions. His gaze fell on the painted buffalo hide, Ayana's creation with its hidden symbols of water-finding knowledge. After a moment's hesitation, he carefully rolled it and added it to his pack. Whatever lay ahead, this connection to Ayana, to the past they had shared and the future represented by Dolly, would go with him. As dusk approached, Malcolm made one final trip to the ridge above the cabin. The 7 graves stood in silent witness against the purpling sky markers of a grief that had defined him for so long. He knelt beside Ayana's symbolic grave, placing his hand on the frozen earth. I found her, he whispered. Our daughter. She's beautiful, strong. Like you. The wind stirred the pine branches overhead, sending a shower of snow crystals cascading down around him. Malcolm closed his eyes, feeling not the resolution he had sought for so many years, but something different. A beginning rather than an end. I'll protect her, he promised, and the knowledge you valued. I won't fail this time. As darkness fell, he made his way back to the cabin for the last time. The women were ready packs, shouldered faces set with determination. Dolly stood with Ruby's support, her feet wrapped in extra layers of fur-lined moccasins Malcolm had prepared. We'll travel north initially, Malcolm told them, shouldering his own pack. Against expectation, There's a pass that cuts west after 5 miles known only to game and a few hunters. It will add distance, but avoid the main trails where we might be spotted. Ruby nodded approval of this strategy. Lead on then. As they stepped into the night, leaving behind the cabin that had been Malcolm's sanctuary and prison for 6 years, a strange sense of lightness filled his chest. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. Yet for the first time since Snake Creek, he was moving toward something rather than away, toward a future that included his daughter, toward a purpose greater than atonement. The stars overhead seemed to pulse with renewed brilliance, and the wind at their backs urged them forwards into the waiting darkness. So ends Part 1. The mountain night wrapped around them like a living thing, breathing, watching, waiting. Malcolm led the way, moving with the confidence of a man who had walked these paths in darknesses countless times. Behind him came Ruby, then Dolly, supported by Istis, with Pahana and Mickey bringing up the rear. They traveled in silence, conserving energy, each lost in private thoughts. The only sounds were their footfalls on packed snow and the occasional whisper of fabric as someone adjusted a pack or offered a steadying hand to Dolly, who struggled but refused to complain. The moon rose 3/4 full, casting the snowscape in silver light and deep shadow. Malcolm kept them to the tree line where possible, using the darkness beneath the pines for cover. His senses were heightened, alert to any sign of pursuit or danger. 2 hours into their journey, they reached the hidden pass he had mentioned, a narrow gap between towering rock faces invisible from below and unmarked on any map. Here Malcolm called a brief halt. Rest, he instructed quietly. Eat something. We have a steep climb ahead. As the women settled onto fallen logs cleared of snow, Malcolm moved to Dolly, checking her condition. The girl's face was drawn with fatigue, but her eyes remained determined. How are the feet? He asked, kneeling before her. They hurt, she admitted, but I can continue. Malcolm nodded, respect mingling with concern. The path narrows ahead. You'll need to lean on me. Ruby, who had been watching this exchange, approached. I'll help her. You need your hands free in case of trouble, Malcolm countered. I know this pass. Every stone, every ice patch. I can guide her safely. A moment of silent evaluation passed between them before Ruby nodded her assent. She handed Dolly a strip of dried meat from her pack. Eat, you need strength. As Dolly chewed the tough jerky, Malcolm moved away to scan their back trail. No signs of pursuit yet, but the night was young, and Sheriff Hollister had struck him as a man who might return with reinforcements sooner rather than later. Pahana joined him, her weathered face solemn in the moonlight. You lived among us once, she said, not a question, but a statement. Malcolm glanced at her, surprised. Ruby told you, Kwam. Ruby tells little. I have eyes. Pahana studied him. You move like someone who learned our ways. Your hands speak our language, even when your mouth is silent. Malcolm turned his gaze back to the trail. I spent 3 years at Fort Richardson, learned what I could. Because you were ordered to. At first. He paused, considering how much to reveal. Later, because I wanted to understand, to bridge the gap between worlds. Pahana made a soft sound. Not quite acceptance, not quite dismissal. Gaps can be crossed, but never closed. Remember that. Before he could respond, she returned to the others, leaving Malcolm with the unsettling feeling that she had taken his measure and found him. Not wanting, perhaps, but incomplete. After 15 minutes of rest, they continued their journey. The pass narrowed as promised, forcing them to proceed single file. Malcolm took Dolly's arm, supporting her weight as they navigated the treacherous terrain. She was lighter than he expected, bird bone like her mother, but with a core of strength that belied her slender frame. Where did you learn to move so quietly? He asked, as they climbed, partly to distract her from the pain, partly from genuine curiosity. Ruby taught me, Dolly replied, her breath visible in the cold air. She says silence is survival. She's right. She taught me many things. How to read tracks, find water, use plants for medicine. A note of pride entered Dolly's voice. She says I learned quickly. You do, Malcolm agreed, thinking of how rapidly she had absorbed his own teachings over the past few days. They climbed in silence for a while, the path growing steeper. Then Dolly asked, why did you help us? You could have turned us away. The question carried echoes of another time, another choice, one that had altered the course of many lives, including his own. Malcolm considered his answer carefully. Because it was the right thing to do. Is that the only reason? Malcolm glanced down at her, finding her eyes, Ayana's eyes, fixed on his face with unsettling perception. No, he admitted, not the only reason. Before she could press further, he called for another brief rest. They had reached the highest point of the piece, where the path leveled briefly before beginning its descent on the western side. From this vantage, the world spread out below them in a vast panorama of moonlit peaks and valleys. The cabin was no longer visible, lost among the trees and shadows. Ahead lay unknown territory, at least to Malcolm. Though he knew these mountains well, he had never ventured far in the direction they now traveled. Ruby joined them, her breath clouding in the frigid air. How much farther to where you suggested we camp? 2 hours, maybe 3 with our current pace, Malcolm replied. There's a sheltered hollow with a hot spring that doesn't freeze even in the deepest winter. We can rest there until morning. Ruby nodded, then turned to Dolly. Can you continue? The girl straightened, squaring her shoulders. Yes. Malcolm saw the pride in Ruby's eyes, the same fierce determination that had kept these women alive against all odds. Whatever differences lay between him and Ruby, they shared this, a respect for courage, for endurance in the face of hardship. They resumed their journey, descending now, which proved even more challenging than the climb. The western side of the pass was steeper, the snow deeper where it had drifted against the mountain face. Malcolm led them, carefully choosing each step with deliberation. Behind them, Istas began to sing softly, a traveling song meant to give strength to weary feet. The melody carried on the night air, haunting and beautiful. One by one, the other women joined in their voices, blending in harmonies that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Malcolm did not sing. It was not his place, but he felt the power of the music, nonetheless, a connection to something ancient and enduring. Even Dolly's steps seemed to grow more certain as the song continued. They had been descending for nearly an hour when Malcolm raised his hand for silence, stopping abruptly. The women froze instantly, the song cutting off as if severed by a knife. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then Malcolm pointed to a ridge about half a mile distant, where a pinprick of light flickered briefly before disappearing. Campfire, he whispered. Ruby moved forward to stand beside him, her eyes narrowed as she scanned the darkness. Hunters, possibly, but Malcolm's instincts said otherwise. More likely Hollister gathered men faster than I anticipated. How would they know which way we went? Mickey asked, her voice barely audible. They don't, Malcolm replied. They're guessing, spreading out to cover the most likely routes. Or setting a trap, Pahana suggested grimly. Malcolm considered their options. The path they were on was the most direct route west, but also the most obvious to anyone familiar with the territory. If Hollister had recruited local hunters or trappers, they would know to watch this pass. We need to change course, he decided. There's another way, less direct, but safer. Ruby gestured for him to lead on. Malcolm guided them away from the main path into a dense stand of pines where the snow was shallower beneath the evergreen canopy. The going was slower here, branches snagging on clothing and packs the ground uneven and treacherous with hidden roots and rocks. Dolly stumbled repeatedly, clearly reaching the limits of her endurance. Without discussion, Malcolm lifted her onto his back, carrying her as he had once carried injured comrades through difficult terrain. She was light, but the added burden made the journey more challenging, especially as they began to climb again, following a game trail that wound upward through increasingly rugged country. After what seemed an eternity, they emerged onto a narrow ledge overlooking a small sheltered valley. Below, barely visible in the moonlight, steam rose from a pool surrounded by snow-covered rocks. The hot spring Malcolm had mentioned. We'll rest there, he said, his voice rough with exertion. It's defensible, and the warmth will help Dolly's recovery. They made their way down to the spring with painful slowness, exhaustion now evident in every movement. When they finally reached the sheltered hollow, Malcolm gently set the Dolly down on a flat rock near the steaming water. No fire, Ruby instructed, though Malcolm hadn't suggested one. Too visible. He nodded agreement. The spring provides enough warmth. We'll survive the night without flames. The women unpacked their meager supplies, setting up a crude camp in the shelter of overhanging rocks. Istas immediately began examining Dolly's feet, unwrapping the bandages to check for further damage. Malcolm watched with concern, but the Apache woman seemed satisfied with what she found, applying fresh salve before rewrapping the injuries. Pahana arranged a watch rotation, assigning herself the first shift despite her obvious fatigue. Malcolm volunteered for the second watch and Ruby for the third. Mickey and Istas would care for Dolly and rest, conserving their strength for the journey ahead. As the others settled into sleep, Malcolm walked the perimeter of their camp, memorizing the terrain, identifying potential escape routes and defensive positions. The hot spring had created a microclimate in this small hollow, the air noticeably warmer than the surrounding mountains. Steam rose continuously, creating a natural fog that would help conceal them from distant observers. When he returned to the main camp, he found Ruby still awake, sitting near Dolly's sleeping form. You should rest, he said quietly, settling onto a rock nearby. Ruby didn't look at him. Soon. They sat in silence for a time, the only sounds the soft breathing of the sleeping women and the gentle bubbling of the spring. Finally, Ruby spoke. You carry her well, with care. Malcolm recognized the statement for what it was. Not quite approval, but an acknowledgement of his concern for Dolly. She's strong, Stronger than she knows. Like her mother. The reference to Ayanna hung between them, fraught with unspoken histories and grievances. Malcolm chose his next words carefully. Tell me about her. After, after Snake Creek. Ruby was silent so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice was low controlled, as if keeping powerful emotions in check. She reached our village 3 days after the attack. Half dead, bleeding, but still walking, still carrying your child. Ruby's eyes reflected the moonlight hard as obsidian. She wouldn't speak of what happened at first. When she finally did, she told us the translator, the white man she had trusted, had betrayed them. I didn't, Malcolm said, the old pain fresh again. I tried to warn them. Fletcher knocked me unconscious when he realized what I was doing. So you've said, it's the truth. Ruby turned to look at him directly. Truth is a luxury our people rarely receive from yours. Malcolm couldn't argue with that. History had taught the Apache that white men's words were unreliable at best, deadly at worst. What happened after she reached your village? He asked, returning to the narrative. Ruby's expression softened slightly, remembering. The child came early, too early. We thought neither would survive, but both proved stronger than expected. Dolly lived. Ayanna. She paused. Her wounds were too severe. Infection set in. She lasted 3 days after the birth, long enough to name her daughter, to give her the amulet you carved. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, imagining Ayanna's final days, the child she had brought into the world against all odds. Did she say anything else about me? She made me promise to keep Dolly safe, to teach her our ways, but also the ways of survival in the changing world. Ruby hesitated, then added, and she said if I ever found you, I should judge for myself whether you deserve to know your daughter. And have you decided? Malcolm asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruby studied him in the dim light. I'm still deciding. With that, she rose and moved to her bedroll, ending the conversation as definitively as she had earlier. Malcolm remained seated, absorbing what he had learned, piecing together the final days of the woman he had loved. Eventually, Pahana approached from her watch position. You should sleep now. I'll wake you when it's your turn to guard. Malcolm nodded, finding a spot where he could rest, while still keeping Dolly in view. Despite his exhaustion, sleep came slowly, his mind turning over Ruby's words, the implications of their journey, the uncertain future that awaited them all. When Pahana woke him for his watch, the moon had set, leaving the world in deeper darkness. Malcolm took up position on a rock outcropping that provided a clear view of the approaches to their camp. The night was utterly still, the silence broken only by the occasional shifting of sleepers and the constant gentle murmur of the hot spring. Halfway through his watch, a soft sound behind him made Malcolm turn. Dolly stood there, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale in the starlight. You should be resting, he said gently. I couldn't sleep. She came closer, moving carefully on her injured feet. May I sit with you? Malcolm nodded, shifting to make room on the rock. They sat together in companionable silence for a time, looking out at the silver-dusted landscape. I dream of her sometimes, Dolly said suddenly. My mother, I never knew her, but I see her face, I hear her voice. Malcolm's throat tightened. What does she say? That I am loved, that I am never alone. Dolly glanced at him. Ruby says my mother was the bravest woman she ever knew. She was, Malcolm agreed, his voice rough with emotion. She was also kind and wise and stubborn when she believed in something. Dolly studied him with those two perceptive eyes. You knew her. It wasn't a question, but Malcolm answered anyway. Yes, at Fort Richardson. Were you friends? The simplicity of the question belied its complexity. What had he and Ayanna been to each other? More than friends, less than the husband and wife they might have become in a different world. We were close, he said finally. I respected her, learned from her. Dolly seemed to accept this. That's why you know our ways, our medicines, our songs. Yes. The girl was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she asked, do you know who my father was? The question hit Malcolm like a physical blow. He had not expected it, had not prepared an answer that would honor Ruby's implicit warning while still respecting Dolly's right to know her heritage. Why do you ask? He hedged. Dolly shrugged, the gesture oddly adult. No one ever speaks of him. When I ask Ruby, she says my mother's blood is what matters, that I am Apache through and through. And that troubles you. No, Dolly gazed out at the mountains. But sometimes I wonder if he was a good man, if he would have been proud of me. Malcolm's heart constricted. Without thinking, he placed his hand over hers. The first time he had initiated such contact. Any father would be proud to have a daughter like you, he said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. Never doubt that. Dolly looked down at their hands, then back at his face, searching for something. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, for she nodded once, then leaned slightly against his shoulder in a gesture of trust. that meant more to Malcolm than any words could have expressed. They remained that way until Ruby came to relieve Malcolm for the final watch. She found them sitting together, dully half asleep against his side. Her expression was unreadable as she approached. "Go rest," she said to Malcolm. "Both of you." Dolly stirred, blinking drowsily. "Is it morning?" "Not yet," Ruby answered, "but soon. Sleep while you can." Malcolm helped Dolly back to her bedroll, ensuring she was comfortable before finding his own place to rest. As he settled down, he caught Ruby watching him, her face softened momentarily by the starlight. There was something in her expression, not quite approval, but perhaps understanding. He closed his eyes, sleep claiming him almost immediately. His last conscious thought was of Dolly's question, if her father would be proud of her. The answer echoed in his dreams beyond measure. Dawn broke clear and cold, the sky a pale, perfect blue above the mountains. Malcolm woke to find the camp already stirring, the women packing their few belongings with practiced efficiency. Dolly sat near the hot spring, soaking her feet in the mineral-rich water under Istis's supervision. Ruby approached as Malcolm rolled up his bedding. "We need to move quickly," she said without preamble. "Which way from here?" Malcolm oriented himself, considering their options. "West and slightly north. There's a river valley beyond the next ridge that will provide cover and easier travel." "How far to the territorial border?" 3 days at our current pace, less if Dolly's condition improves." Ruby nodded, processing this information. "And beyond the border, unorganized territory, nominally under federal jurisdiction but in practice largely ungoverned." Malcolm studied her face. "Is that where we're headed? Beyond reach of territorial authorities?" "For now," Ruby replied, giving nothing away. "Let's move out as soon as Dolly is ready." Within the hour, they were on the trail again. The day promised to be clear, which meant better travel conditions, but also increased visibility. Malcolm led them through stands of pine and fir, wherever possible, keeping to terrain that offered concealment. Dolly moved more easily this morning, the hot spring treatment having eased much of her pain. She still required assistance on difficult stretches, but her resilience was remarkable, a testament to the strength she had inherited from both her parents. By midday, they had covered significant ground descending into the river valley Malcolm had mentioned. Here they paused briefly to refill water containers from the partially frozen stream. As Mickey knelt by the water, her hands suddenly froze above the surface. She remained motionless, head tilted, as if listening to something only she could hear. After a moment, she dipped her fingers into the stream, then brought them to her lips, tasting. "There is a spring upstream," she announced, "a true source, not just meltwater." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, impressed. The ability to sense water sources was precisely the knowledge that made Mickey valuable and dangerous to men like Blackwood. "Is it far?" Ruby asked. Mickey considered her expression distant, as if communing with something beyond ordinary perception. "No, less than an hour's walk." "We don't have time for detours," Pahana objected. "It's not a detour," Mickey insisted quietly. "It's a sign. The water speaks of a safe place nearby." Malcolm glanced at Ruby, curious how she would resolve this disagreement. To his surprise, she deferred to Mickey without hesitation. "Lead us," she instructed. They followed the young woman upstream, moving away from their planned route. Malcolm remained alert, scanning constantly for any sign of pursuit or danger. But the valley remained peaceful. The only sounds their own movements and the gentle gurgle of the partially frozen stream. After approximately 40 minutes, the narrow valley opened into a small clearing. At its center, surrounded by a ring of stones clearly placed by human hands, a spring bubbled up from the earth, its water steaming slightly in the cold air. Mickey approached the spring, reverently kneeling beside it and placing both hands on the ground nearby. She closed her eyes, murmuring words too low for Malcolm to catch. The others waited respectfully, understanding the significance of the moment. Even Malcolm, though not raised in their traditions, recognized the sacred nature of what was occurring. After several minutes, Mickey rose. "This is a medicine spring," she announced. "Known to our ancestors but forgotten in recent generations. It offers healing and protection." "Protection from what?" Malcolm asked. Mickey regarded him steadily. "From those who would take rather than receive. The water knows friend from enemy." Before Malcolm could ask for clarification, a sound from the ridge above them froze everyone in place. The distant but unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. Ruby reacted instantly. "Into the trees, now!" They moved swiftly to the edge of the clearing, taking cover among the pines. Malcolm positioned himself where he could observe the ridge while remaining concealed. "Could be hunters," he said, though he didn't believe it. "No," Pahana replied grimly. "They found our trail." Another shot rang out closer this time, followed by the faint sound of voices. Malcolm strained to hear catching fragments carried on the cold air. "Tracks lead this way. 500 for the leader, 200 each for the others. Colonel wants the young one alive." Malcolm's blood ran cold. They were hunting Dolly specifically. Whether because of her connection to him or because they believed she shared Mickey's water-finding abilities, he couldn't be certain. Either way, the threat was immediate and deadly. How many? Ruby asked, her voice barely audible. Malcolm studied the ridge. 3, maybe 4, coming down from the north. Armed. Rifles certainly, probably sidearms as well. Ruby processed this information quickly. We're outnumbered and outgunned. We need to separate, draw them away from Dolly and Mickey. No, Malcolm countered. Splitting up makes us vulnerable. There's another way. He gestured to the springs. The water creates mist. We can use it for cover, set up an ambush. Ruby considered his suggestion, then nodded sharply. Pahana, you and Istis take Dolly and Mickey to the far side of the clearing. Stay hidden. Malcolm and I will handle this. The women moved silently, following Ruby's instructions without question. When they were positioned, Ruby turned to Malcolm. What's your plan? They'll follow our tracks to the spring. We set up on either side, wait until they're in the clearing, then take them by surprise. Malcolm checked his rifle. I won't kill unless absolutely necessary. Ruby's expression hardened. These men hunt us like animals. They deserve no mercy. This isn't about what they deserve, Malcolm replied quietly. It's about what we become if we kill when there are alternatives. A complex emotion flickered across Ruby's face. Not quite agreement, but not rejection either. After a moment, she nodded once, then moved to take up position on the western edge of the clearing. Malcolm circled to the east, finding a spot that offered both concealment and a clear line of sight to the approach. He settled in to wait, controlling his breathing, becoming as still as the pines around him. The minutes stretched, tension mounting with each passing moment. Then finally, movement at the northern edge of the clearing, 3 men emerging from the trees, rifles ready, moving with the caution of experienced hunters. Malcolm recognized the lead figure immediately, Sheriff Boyd Hollister. The other 2 were strangers to him, likely local men recruited for the hunt with promises of reward money. They approached the spring, cautiously studying the tracks that led to its edge. They were here, one of the men said, kneeling to examine a footprint, not more than an hour ago. Hollister surveyed the clearing. Spread out, check the tree line. They can't have gone far with a wounded girl slowing them down. The men began to move outward from the spring, weapons raised. Malcolm tensed, preparing to act, when a flash of movement from the far side of the clearing caught his attention. Mickey had risen from her hiding place and was walking calmly toward the spring, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by the armed men. Malcolm's heart leaped into his throat, but before he could move or call out, he realized this was deliberate, a diversion. Hollister and his men swung their rifles toward Mickey, momentarily distracted from their search of the perimeter. It was the opening Malcolm needed. He emerged from cover and moved swiftly behind the nearest hunter, disarming him with a swift, practiced movement before the man could react. Simultaneously, Ruby appeared on the opposite side, her knife at Hollister's throat, before he could bring his weapon to bear on Mickey. The third man froze, caught between threats. Drop the rifle, Malcolm ordered, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. Slowly. The man hesitated, calculating his odds. Malcolm applied more pressure to the arm lock he had established, causing his captive to gasp in pain. He'll break it, the captured man warned his companion. For God's sake, Jennings, drop the gun. Jennings complied reluctantly, letting his rifle fall to the ground. Malcolm gestured for him to step away from the weapon. On your knees, both of you, he instructed, maintaining his hold on the first man. As they complied, Ruby addressed Hollister, her knife still at his throat. Why are you hunting us? Hollister remained remarkably composed despite his position. Just following orders, ma'am, nothing personal. Whose orders? Malcolm demanded. Blackwood's. A flicker of surprise crossed Hollister's face. You know the colonel. I know of him, Malcolm replied carefully. I know he's obsessed with finding water sources in Apache territory. I know he's willing to kill for that knowledge. Hollister's eyes narrowed slightly. You're more involved in this than you let on, Sullivan. Answer the question. Ruby pressed the knife edge, drawing a thin line of blood across Hollister's throat. Why does Blackwood want us? Why does he want the girl specifically? For the first time, uncertainty showed in Hollister's expression. The girl, he didn't mention any girl specifically, just said to bring in all of you alive if possible. Ruby and Malcolm exchanged glances, both recognizing the inconsistency with what they had overheard. Someone had mentioned wanting the young one alive, but if not Hollister, a twig snapped in the forest beyond the clearing, a small sound but enough to alert Malcolm that something was wrong. He scanned the tree line, suddenly aware they might be facing more than the 3 men they had captured. Ruby, he began, a warning in his voice. Before he could continue, a shot rang out from the trees. Malcolm felt the bullet pass close enough to stir the air by his face. Instinctively, he dropped to the ground, pulling his captive down with him for cover. Ruby reacted with similar speed, but not before a second shot struck her arm, causing her to release Hollister. The sheriff rolled away, reaching for his fallen weapon. Malcolm released his captive and fired twice into the trees where the shots had originated, not aiming to hit, but to provide covering fire. Ruby fall back. Chaos erupted in the clearing. Hollister and his men scrambled for their weapons, while Malcolm continued firing toward the unseen assailant in the forest. Ruby, clutching her wounded arm, retreated toward the position where Dolly and the others were hidden. A figure emerged from the trees. A fourth man, tall and lean, dressed in the manner of a professional bounty hunter, rather than a local volunteer. He moved with cold precision, tracking Ruby with his rifle as she fled. Malcolm shifted his aim and fired, striking the man's shoulder. The bounty hunter staggered but didn't fall, turning his attention toward Malcolm instead. In the moment of distraction, Istis emerged from cover, helping Ruby reach safety, while Pahana provided protection, a small hunting bow in her hands that Malcolm hadn't noticed before. Hollister had regained his rifle and was shouting orders to his men, trying to re-establish control of the situation. Malcolm used the confusion to work his way around the edge of the clearing, intending to rejoin the women and organize a retreat. As he moved, he caught sight of Mickey still standing calmly by the spring, despite the gunfire erupting around her. Her hands were raised, palms down toward the water, her lips moving in what appeared to be a chant or prayer. The spring began to bubble more vigorously, steam rising in thickening clouds that rapidly spread across the clearing. Within moments, visibility was reduced to mere feet, the mist enveloping everything in a white shroud. Malcolm used the cover to reach Mickey, grasping her arm. "We need to go. Now." She looked at him, her eyes unnaturally bright. "The water protects its own," she said simply, allowing him to lead her toward the others. They found Ruby, Dolly, Pahana, and Istis gathered at the southern edge of the clearing. Ruby's arm was bound with a strip of cloth, blood already soaking through the makeshift bandage. "How bad?" Malcolm asked, examining the wound quickly. "Through and through," Ruby replied, her voice tight with pain but steady. "I've had worse." From the clearing came shouts of confusion as Hollister and his men tried to orient themselves in the unnaturally thick mist. The fog seemed to be growing denser rather than dissipating, defying natural laws. "We need to move while they're disoriented," Malcolm said. "Head south along the stream. I'll cover our retreat." Ruby nodded, gesturing for the others to move out. As they turned to go, Dolly hesitated, looking back at Malcolm. "You're coming?" she asked, fear evident in her voice for the first time since he had known her. "Right behind you," he promised. "Go with Ruby now." The girl obeyed reluctantly, disappearing into the trees with the others. Malcolm took up position at the edge of the clearing, rifle ready, prepared to delay pursuit if necessary. The mist continued to thicken, obscuring everything in the clearing. The voices of Hollister and his men grew more distant, as if they were moving away rather than toward the southern edge where Malcolm waited. After several tense minutes, the sounds faded entirely. Malcolm remained in position, wary of a trick, but as time passed and no one emerged from the mist, he began to wonder if something unexpected had occurred. Cautiously, he moved forward into the fog, rifle raised and ready. Visibility was near zero, forcing him to navigate by memory and instinct. When he reached the area where the spring should have been, he found only undisturbed ground. No bubbling water, no ring of stones, nothing to indicate a spring had ever existed there. Confused, Malcolm continued across the clearing, eventually emerging from the mist on the northern side. The trees stood silent and empty, with no sign of Hollister or his men. Malcolm backtracked, searching for trails for any indication of where the pursuers had gone. He found footprints leading into the mist from the north, but nothing leading out in any direction. It was as if Hollister and his companions had simply vanished. Uneasy, Malcolm retreated to the southern edge and followed the women's trail. He caught up with them half a mile downstream, where they had paused to treat Ruby's wound more thoroughly. "They're gone," he reported, still perplexed. "No sign of them anywhere." The women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Mickey who finally spoke. "The water protected us," she said simply. "As I told you it would." Malcolm wanted to press for clarification to understand what had happened in rational terms, but something in Mickey's expression stopped him. Some mysteries, perhaps, were not meant to be dissected and explained. "We should keep moving," he said instead. "Whether they're gone or not, we've lost our advantage of secrecy. Others will come." They continued downstream until dusk, making good time despite Ruby's injury and Dolly's still healing feet. The valley narrowed and deepened, the stream growing more vigorous as tributaries joined it from the surrounding slopes. When darkness made further travel dangerous, they made camp in a small cave formed by an overhanging ledge. It offered protection from the elements and concealment from searching eyes. Istas tended to Ruby's wound, applying a poultice of herbs carried in her medicine pouch. Malcolm watched, impressed by her skill and the obvious improvement in Ruby's condition under her care. You're a healer, he observed. Istas nodded without looking up from her work. It is my calling. Like your mother before you, Pahana added, from where she sat keeping watch at the cave entrance. Malcolm's curiosity was piqued. Is that common for such gifts to pass through bloodlines? Some talents run in families, Pahana replied. Istas comes from a line of healers stretching back many generations. Mickey's gift for finding water is rarer, but also inherited. Malcolm glanced at Dolly, wondering what gifts she might have inherited. From Ayana, from himself, from ancestors, neither of them had known. Already she showed intelligence, resilience, and aptitude for learning both practical skills and abstract concepts. As if sensing his thoughts, Ruby spoke. Dolly has her own gifts. They will reveal themselves in time. The girl looked up at the mention of her name, her eyes meeting Malcolm's across the small space. Something passed between them. Recognition, connection, the unspoken acknowledgement of shared blood. After a simple meal of jerky and dried berries, they settled in for the night. Malcolm took first watch, positioning himself where he could observe both the cave entrance and the surrounding terrain. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the black sky. No sign of pursuit, no distant campfires, nothing to indicate danger. Yet Malcolm remained vigilant, his senses attuned to the slightest change in the night sounds. Midway through his watch, Ruby joined him. Her wounded arm was bandaged neatly, supported by a sling fashioned from a spare piece of cloth. You should be resting, Malcolm said quietly. I've rested enough. She settled beside him, her good arm resting on her drawn-up knee. What happened back there at the spring? You seemed disturbed. Malcolm considered his response. I've seen many things I couldn't explain during my time with your people, but never anything like that. The disappearance of our pursuers. Yes. Ruby was silent for a moment, looking out at the star-filled sky. There are forces at work in this world that white men's science cannot explain. Forces your people have forgotten how to see or hear. You believe the spring, what transported them somewhere else, made them invisible. Ruby shook her head. I don't know exactly what happened, but I know Mickey communed with the water spirits and they responded to protect us. That is enough. Malcolm wasn't satisfied with this explanation, but he recognized he would get nothing more concrete. In the spring itself, it vanished as well. Sacred places reveal themselves only when needed, only to those worthy of their gifts. Ruby glanced at him. That you saw it at all is significant. Before Malcolm could ask what she meant, she changed the subject. Dolly asked about her father. The statement caught him off guard. Yes, last night during my watch. What did you tell her? Nothing specific. That any father would be proud of her. Malcolm met Ruby's gaze directly. I didn't reveal myself, if that's what you're asking. Ruby nodded, satisfied. Good. But she deserves to know eventually, Malcolm added, when the time is right. And when would that be? There was no hostility in Ruby's question, only genuine inquiry. Malcolm thought carefully before answering. When we're safe, when she's ready, when knowing won't put her in more danger than she already faces. And if that time never comes, the possibility cut deep, but Malcolm forced himself to consider it honestly. Then I will have been privileged to know her, even if she never knows me as her father. Ruby studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the starlight. Finally, she said, You are not what Ayana described in her final days. Not what I expected to find. People change, Malcolm replied simply. Loss shapes us. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not. And which are you? Malcolm looked toward the cave where Dolly slept, considering the question. I don't know, but meeting her, knowing she survived, has changed me again. Made me want to be worthy of being her father, whether she ever knows it or not. Ruby's expression softened slightly. There's Apache blood in her veins, Apache spirit in her heart. But I see you in her too, in her stubbornness, in the way she watches, listens, learns. The acknowledgement meant more to Malcolm than he could express. Before he could respond, Ruby continued, Tomorrow we cross into unmapped territory, beyond the reach of territorial law, but not beyond Blackwood's influence. The danger will increase. I understand. Do you? Ruby's voice sharpened. Blackwood isn't just another army officer. He's obsessed with controlling water rights throughout the territory. He believes whoever controls water controls everything. Mining, farming, settlement, patterns, trade routes. And he's right, Malcolm acknowledged, which is why Mickey's knowledge is so valuable and so dangerous. Not just Mickey's knowledge, Ruby corrected. The knowledge itself isn't the true prize. It's her ability, her gift for communing with water, for finding sources where others see only barren land. That can't be written down or stolen. It must be freely given or it dies with her. Malcolm considered this. That's why Blackwood wants her alive. Yes, and why he'll never stop hunting her. Ruby's voice dropped lower. Or any of us who might have shared in her knowledge. The implication was clear. Dolly, as Mickey's apprentice or potential successor, would be hunted as well. Perhaps that explained the overheard comment about wanting the young one alive. We won't let that happen, Malcolm said, a promise in his voice. I won't let that happen. Ruby nodded, accepting his commitment. She rose to go back inside the cave, but paused. Ayana made me promise something else before she died. Something I haven't told you. Malcolm waited, sensing the importance of what was coming. She said if I ever found you, if I ever believed you were worthy of knowing Dolly, I should give you something. Ruby reached inside her dress and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. This. She placed it in Malcolm's hand. A carved wooden disc, smaller than his palm, intricate symbols etched into its surface. He recognized Ayana's craftsmanship immediately. What is it? He asked, turning it carefully in his fingers. A map, Ruby replied. Not of places, but of sources. Water sources known only to our most trusted water finders. Ayana was learning to create these maps before Snake Creek. This was her first. Malcolm stared at the object with new understanding. Why would she want me to have this? She said you would know when the time came, that you would understand what to do with it. Ruby's eyes held his. Do you? Malcolm shook his head slowly. Not yet, but I will protect it with my life until I do. Ruby seemed satisfied with this answer. Get some rest. I'll take watch now. As she moved to take his position, Malcolm returned to the cave, the carved disc secure in his pocket. Inside, the others slept peacefully, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place or the new responsibility that had been placed in Malcolm's hands. He found a spot near Dolly and settled down his mind, turning over Ruby's words, the implications of Ayana's final gift. Something told him that understanding would come soon. Perhaps too soon and at too high a price. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the night sky, marking the passage of hours. In the darkness before dawn, Malcolm finally slept, his dreams filled with running water and Ayana's voice distant but clear, guiding him towards something he couldn't yet see. Morning brought heavy clouds and the threat of snow. They broke camp quickly, Ruby insisting they cover as much ground as possible before the weather deteriorated. Malcolm led them deeper into the river valley, following the increasingly rapid stream as it carved its way westward through the mountains. The terrain grew more rugged, the canyon walls steeper, but the path beside the water remained navigable. Dolly kept pace surprisingly well. Her feet nearly healed, her natural resilience asserting itself. She stayed close to Malcolm, asking questions about the land, the plants they passed, the signs of wildlife, he pointed out. Her eagerness to learn, her sharp observations, reminded him painfully of Ayana. By midday, the first snowflakes began to fall, large wet flakes that clung to clothing and hair. The temperature dropped steadily, the wind picking up, driving the snow horizontally at times. We need shelter, Pahana called, her voice nearly lost in a sudden gust. This will be a true storm. Malcolm nodded agreement. There's a formation ahead, a natural overhang. It should provide protection until this passes. They pushed forward, the storm intensifying with each passing minute. Visibility decreased rapidly, the world reduced to swirling white. Malcolm kept them close to the canyon wall, away from the increasingly treacherous edge that dropped to the rushing stream below. When they finally reached the overhang, he had mentioned all were soaked and shivering. The natural shelter was deep enough to accommodate all of them and provided good protection from the wind and snow. We can risk a small fire, Malcolm decided, noting Dolly's blue-tinged lips. The storm will hide the smoke, and we need warmth. While Istis and Pihana gathered what dry wood they could find beneath the overhang, Malcolm worked with Mickey to clear a space and prepare a fire pit. Ruby kept watch, her injured arm clearly paining her, though she made no complaint. Once the fire was established, they huddled around it, gratefully spreading wet outer garments nearby to dry. Dolly leaned against Malcolm's side, her small body shivering, despite the growing warmth. Without thinking, he put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. The storm is a blessing, Mickey said suddenly, her eyes on the swirling snow beyond their shelter. It covers our tracks, confuses our pursuers. If they're still pursuing, Pahana added, after what happened at the spring. Malcolm had been pondering that mystery since yesterday. Do you think they're truly gone, or just delayed somehow? Mickey's expression was serene. The water takes what it needs, gives what it chooses. I cannot speak for its decisions. Not for the first time, Malcolm found himself wondering about the extent of Mickey's abilities and the beliefs that surrounded them. Was it truly supernatural power they had witnessed, or some natural phenomenon they didn't yet understand? Ruby, reading his expression, said quietly, Not everything can be explained in your terms, Malcolm. Some things must simply be accepted. He nodded, acknowledging the gentle rebuke. Where I come from, we have a saying, There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Wise words. Isas commented, surprising him. She had rarely spoken directly to him before. Your people have not always forgotten wisdom. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. The storm showed no signs of abating, suggesting they would be confined to the shelter until at least the following day. As evening approached, Ruby distributed the last of their food supplies, a meager meal of dried meat and a handful of berries for each person. Malcolm noted with concern how their provisions were dwindling. They would need to hunt soon or find another source of sustenance. After they had eaten, Dolly surprised everyone by beginning to sing, a clear, sweet voice rising above the storm's fury. It was an Apache song Malcolm recognized, a story of the first people finding their way through darkness, guided by animal spirits. One by one, the other women joined in, even Ruby adding her voice to the harmony. The song filled their small shelter, creating a space of warmth and connection amid the hostile elements. When the song ended, Dolly looked up at Malcolm. "Will you tell us a story from your people?" He hesitated, uncertain what would be appropriate or welcome. Sensing his discomfort, Ruby nodded encouragement. "Yes, Sullivan, let us hear a story from your tradition." Malcolm thought for a moment, then began a tale his Irish grandmother had told him as a child. The story of Oisin and Neve, of a mortal man who followed a woman of magic to her otherworld, only to discover upon his return that centuries had passed in what seemed to him mere years. He told it well, his translator's gift for language serving him as he wove the ancient Celtic tale. The women listened attentively, Dolly most of all, her eyes wide with wonder at this glimpse into a mythology so different from her own. When he finished, Pahana nodded thoughtfully. "Your people once understood the shifting nature of time and reality, before they forgot." "Some remember," Malcolm said, "those who still listen to the old stories." "Stories are how we survive," Eastus agreed, "how we pass knowledge from one generation to the next, how we remember who we are." The philosophical turn of the conversation surprised Malcolm. These women, whom many whites would dismiss as savages, demonstrated a depth of thought and understanding that put most educated Europeans to shame. As the evening progressed, they shared more stories. Apache tales of creation and trickster spirits, Malcolm's memories of Irish myths and biblical parables. The exchange created a bridge between their different worlds, a recognition of shared humanity despite all that divided them. Eventually, watches were assigned for the night. Malcolm took the middle shift, allowing himself to drift into sleep, with Dolly still curled trustingly against his side. He woke to Pahana's touch on his shoulder, the shelter dark, except for the dying embers of the fire. Outside, the storm continued, unabated snow piling higher against the entrance to their refuge. Malcolm carefully extracted himself from Dolly's sleeping form and moved to the watch position near the opening. The night was impenetrable, a solid wall of swirling white, the wind's howl drowning all other sounds. He was halfway through his watch when a movement in the snow caught his attention, a darker shape against the whiteness there, and gone so quickly he thought he might have imagined it. Malcolm tensed, rifle ready, watching intently. Nothing moved for several long minutes. Then just as he began to relax, the shape appeared again, definitely human, definitely approaching their shelter. He considered waking the others, but decided against it immediately. Better to assess the threat first. One person might be a lost traveler, someone in need of help rather than an enemy. The figure drew closer, moving with difficulty through the deep snow. When it was within 20 yards, Malcolm could make out more details. A man heavily bundled against the cold, no visible weapons. "That's far enough," Malcolm called, his voice carrying over the storm's noise. "Identify yourself." The figure stopped, raising gloved hands to show they were empty. "I come in peace," a man's voice replied, in the words almost lost in the wind. "I seek shelter from the storm." "Who are you?" Malcolm demanded, not lowering his rifle. "A traveler like yourself." The man took another step forward. "Please, I'm freezing to death out here." Malcolm hesitated, instinct warring with humanity. The storm was indeed deadly. Turning away anyone, even a potential threat, might be a death sentence. "Approach slowly," he instructed. "Keep your hands visible." The stranger complied, moving with exaggerated care through the snowdrifts. As he came closer, the firelight illuminated his features. A man perhaps 50 years old, his beard frosted with ice, his eyes tired but alert. "Thank you," he said as he reached the shelter's entrance. "I didn't think I'd survive another hour out there." Malcolm gestured for him to sit on the opposite side of the fire embers, keeping the rifle within easy reach. "What brings you into these mountains during winter?" The man rubbed his hands together, seeking warmth. "I could ask you the same question." "I asked first." A small smile touched the stranger's lips. "Fair enough. I'm a surveyor. working for the territorial government mapping the western reaches. Got separated from my team in the storm. The explanation was plausible, but something about it struck Malcolm as rehearsed. You're a long way from any survey line I know of. New project, confidential. The man glanced around the shelter, taking note of the sleeping women. I see I'm not the only one traveling with companions. They're resting, Malcolm said, a warning in his tone. I suggest we keep our voices down. The stranger nodded, turning his attention back to warming his hands. Of course, I'm grateful for the shelter. I'll be on my way as soon as the storm breaks. Malcolm studied him, trying to place why the man seemed vaguely familiar. There was something about the way he held himself, the careful precision of his speech. Realization struck like a thunderbolt. Though they had never met, Malcolm had seen this man's portrait hanging in the commandant's office at Fort Richardson. Colonel Vernon Blackwood himself had found them. Malcolm kept his expression neutral, not wanting to alert Blackwood that he'd been recognized. His mind raced, evaluating options, potential threats. Was Blackwood truly alone, or were others positioned nearby waiting for a signal? You're lucky we found this overhang, Malcolm said casually. Not many shelters in this area. Indeed. Blackwood's eyes, now that Malcolm looked more closely, were calculating beneath a facade of exhaustion. Fortune smiles on the prepared, however. I always carry emergency supplies. As if to illustrate his point, Blackwood reached slowly into his coat. Malcolm tensed, but the man withdrew only a small flask, offering it to Malcolm. Brandy, he explained. Medicinal, of course. Malcolm shook his head. I don't drink. Blackwood shrugged and took a swallow himself. Your loss. The conversation lapsed into silence, both men watching each other while pretending not to. Malcolm knew he needed to wake Ruby to warn her without alerting Blackwood, but any sudden movement might trigger whatever plan the colonel had in mind. The decision was taken from his hands when Dolly stirred, sitting up and blinking sleepily at the stranger by the fire. Who are you? She asked directly, her voice clear in the confined space. Blackwood turned to her, his expression softening in a way that made Malcolm's skin crawl. Just a lost traveler, little one, seeking shelter from the storm. The sound of Dolly's voice had awakened Ruby, who came instantly alert at the sight of the stranger. She sat up, her good hand moving subtly toward the knife at her belt. A fortunate coincidence, she said, her voice neutral, but her eyes sharp as she evaluated the newcomer. Isn't it? Blackwood agreed pleasantly. Finding fellow travelers in such remote territory. Malcolm caught Ruby's eye, trying to communicate his recognition of Blackwood without words. Whether she understood or simply shared his suspicion, she nudged Pahana awake with her foot while maintaining her focus on the stranger. Soon all the women were awake, the small shelter tense with unspoken awareness that something was wrong. Blackwood, for his part, maintained his affable facade, though his eyes constantly moved, assessing each person, noting positions, relationships. Since we're all awake, he said eventually, perhaps introductions are in order. I'm Vernon, Territorial Surveyor. Malcolm, Malcolm replied, offering nothing more. And my companions prefer their privacy. Blackwood raised an eyebrow. Of course, though I must say it's unusual to see Apache women traveling in the company of a white man, especially in such difficult conditions. The direct acknowledgement that he recognized their heritage confirmed Malcolm's worst fears. This was no chance encounter. Ruby spoke before Malcolm could respond. The storm is passing, she said, though there was no evidence of this from the howling wind outside. We should prepare to move on. Blackwood smiled thinly. I don't think anyone will be traveling for some time yet. This storm has settled in for the duration. He took another sip from his flask, which gives us time to become better acquainted. His gaze settled on Mickey, who sat perfectly still, her eyes lowered. I'm particularly interested in your knowledge of the area. Local water sources, for instance. My survey work focuses on hydrological mapping, you see. The pretense was growing thinner by the moment. Malcolm shifted slightly, positioning himself between Blackwood and the women, particularly Dolly. As I said, my companions value their privacy, he repeated firmly, and we've shared all the shelter we can spare. Blackwood's pleasant expression hardened almost imperceptibly. I'm afraid I must insist on their cooperation. Especially, his eyes moved to Mickey again, the one with the water-finding gift. The facade had dropped entirely now. Malcolm raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Blackwood. I think it's time for you to leave, Colonel. Blackwood didn't appear surprised at being recognized. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sullivan. Give me one reason why not. I can give you several, Blackwood replied calmly. First, I'm not alone. My men have this shelter surrounded despite the storm. Second, I know who you are, the translator who betrayed his post at Fort Richardson. And third, He smiled coldly. I know that girl is your daughter. The last statement hit Malcolm like a physical blow. How could Blackwood possibly know about Dolly's parentage? Before he could recover, a sharp whistle cut through the storm's noise. Blackwood's smile widened. That would be my signal. Make this easy on yourself, Sullivan. On all of you. Cooperate, and no one needs to get hurt. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Blackwood confident in his advantage, Malcolm desperately calculating options, the women tense and ready for whatever came next. Then Mickey spoke, her voice soft but carrying an undercurrent of power that made everyone turn toward her. The water remembers, she said, her eyes now fixed on Blackwood. It remembers what you did at Snake Creek, the blood you spilled, the lives you took. Blackwood's expression flickered uncertainty, replacing confidence for a brief moment. Superstitious nonsense. Is it? Mickey rose slowly to her feet. The water has been watching you, Colonel, following you, waiting for this moment. As if in response to her words, the storm's howl increased in volume, the wind driving snow into the shelter with sudden fury. The fire embers scattered, plunging them into near darkness. In the confusion, Malcolm heard Ruby shout a command in Apache. The women moved with practiced coordination, grabbing their few possessions. Malcolm maintained his aim at Blackwood, who had risen to his feet. You can't escape, the colonel warned, raising his voice above the storm. My men will cut you down the moment you step outside. We'll take our chances, Malcolm replied, backing toward the exit while keeping his rifle trained on Blackwood. Outside, the storm had reached impossible intensity, snow and wind, creating a white wall that obscured everything beyond a few feet. Malcolm could see no sign of Blackwood's supposed men, though that didn't mean they weren't there. Ruby appeared at his side, Dolly close behind her. This way, she said, pointing along the canyon wall. Mickey says there's a path. Malcolm hesitated. Blackwood's men cannot see through this, Ruby cut him off. The storm protects us. Mickey has made sure of it. Looking back, Malcolm saw Mickey still facing Blackwood, her hands raised as if conducting the elements themselves. The colonel stood frozen, whether from caution or some power Malcolm couldn't comprehend, he couldn't tell. Now, Ruby urged. While she holds him, Malcolm made his decision. Grabbing Dolly's hand, he plunged into the storm, after Ruby trusting her to lead them to safety once more. Behind them, Mickey's voice rose in a chant that seemed to merge with the howling wind, becoming indistinguishable from the storm's fury. The last thing Malcolm saw as they rounded a bend in the canyon was the surveyor's shelter collapsing under the weight of accumulated snow, bearing everything and everyone inside. So ends part 2. The storm became their ally, a raging tempest that swallowed sound and erased vision beyond an arm's length. Malcolm gripped Dolly's hand tightly as they struggled forward, following Ruby's barely visible form ahead. The wind tore at their clothing, driving needles of ice against any exposed skin. Yet they pushed on away from Blackwood, away from the collapsing shelter. Pahana and Istis moved like shadows through the white chaos, somehow maintaining their bearings despite the blinding conditions. Malcolm had lost all sense of direction, trusting Ruby's guidance completely as they hugged the canyon wall. Mickey, Dolly shouted over the wind, looking back. Where's Mickey? Malcolm turned, straining to see through the swirling snow. There was no sign of the young waterfinder. Had she been trapped in the collapse, captured by Blackwood's men, or had she simply disappeared like their pursuers at the sacred spring? Ruby appeared at his side, snow crusting her eyelashes and hair. She'll find us, she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. The water guides her. Malcolm wanted to argue, to insist they go back for Mickey, but the practical part of him knew it would be suicide. The storm was intensifying, temperatures dropping rapidly. Their primary goal had to be finding shelter before hypothermia claimed them all. This way, Ruby urged, tugging his sleeve. Mickey showed me before everything happened. There's a place ahead. They pressed forward, the canyon narrowing until they were forced to move single file backs against the rock wall. The drop to their right was invisible in the white void, but Malcolm could hear the rush of water far below. The stream had become a river, swollen with snowmelt and storm runoff. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, Ruby halted, feeling along the canyon wall. Her fingers found what she was searching for, a narrow opening barely visible against the dark stone, just wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. In here, she directed, disappearing into the crevice. Malcolm ushered Dolly through next, then Pahana and Istis, taking one last look back for Mickey before following them into the darkness. The passage was tight, claustrophobic, the rough stone scraping against his shoulders as he inched forward. Then abruptly, it widened, opening into a space large enough to stand upright. In the near-total darkness, Malcolm could sense rather than see that they had entered a cave of some kind. The howling of the storm diminished to a distant moan, the air noticeably warmer than outside. We need light, he said, fumbling in his pack for matches and the small candle stub he carried for emergencies. The flame caught, illuminating their sanctuary. It was indeed a cave larger than he had initially thought, perhaps 30 feet deep and 20 wide, the ceiling high enough that he couldn't see it in the limited candlelight. The floor was surprisingly level, covered with fine sand rather than the rough stone he had expected. More surprising still were the markings on the walls, pictographs in red and black and white depicting human figures, animals, and symbols Malcolm didn't recognize. They appeared ancient, the pigments faded by time but still clearly visible. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice hushed in the cavernous space. Ruby was examining the wall paintings with evident recognition. A sacred site, a place of visions and healing. "You knew it was here." "Mickey knew," Ruby corrected. "She told me to find the split rock if we became separated. Said it would provide shelter from both the storm and our enemies." Malcolm raised the candle higher, trying to see more of the cave's interior. At the back, a small pool reflected the flickering light, its surface perfectly still. Water seeped from the rock above, feeding the pool, with a slow, steady drip that echoed in the silence. "We're safe here," Ruby assured him, reading his concern. "The entrance is nearly invisible from outside, and the storm will cover our tracks." Malcolm nodded, allowing himself to relax slightly. "What about Mickey? If she directed you here, surely she plans to join us." Ruby's expression was inscrutable. "Mickey walks her own path. She will find us when the time is right." This cryptic response did little to ease Malcolm's worry, but he recognized that pressing for more information would be futile. Instead, he focused on practical matters, establishing their temporary camp, taking inventory of their remaining supplies, checking on Dolly and the others. The girl appeared exhausted but unharmed. Her eyes widened as she studied the pictographs on the cave walls. Pahana had already settled near the entrance, assuming her customary watchful position. Istus was examining Ruby's wounded arm, which had begun bleeding again during their flight. "Let me help," Malcolm offered, moving to assist Istus with fresh bandages from his pack. As they worked, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed some threshold. Not just physical, but spiritual. This cave, with its ancient artwork and hidden water source, felt removed from the world, outside a place where different rules might apply. Once Ruby's wound was redressed and everyone had taken some water and a small portion of their dwindling food supplies, Malcolm attempted to piece together what had happened at the overhang. "Blackwood knew who I was," he said to Ruby, keeping his voice low so Dolly wouldn't overhear. "He knew about my connection to Dolly." Ruby's expression darkened. "Someone betrayed us, or he has resources we didn't anticipate." He seemed confident his men had us surrounded despite the storm. "Perhaps they did," Ruby conceded, "or perhaps it was a bluff." Malcolm shook his head. "Blackwood isn't the type to bluff. If he said his men were there, they were there." "Then where are they now? Why haven't they pursued us?" It was a valid question, one for which Malcolm had no answer. Had Mickey's apparent control of the elements somehow incapacitated Blackwood's forces, or were they even now searching for the hidden cave entrance, preparing to trap them inside? "We should rest while we can," Ruby decided, ending the speculation. "The storm may last through the night. When it passes, we'll need to move quickly." Malcolm agreed, though he doubted he would find much rest. They established a watch rotation once again, with Malcolm taking the first shift. The others arranged themselves around the cave, using their packs as pillows, conserving body heat by staying close together. Dolly settled near Malcolm as he took up position near the narrow entrance. "Will Mickey find us?" she asked, her voice small in the vastness of the cave. "I believe she will," Malcolm answered, more confident than he felt. "She seems to have special ways of knowing things." Dolly nodded, accepting this. "Like the disappearing spring." "Yes. Ruby says there are forces in the world that can't be explained with words," Dolly continued, "that we have to feel them instead." "Ruby is wise," Malcolm said, echoing his earlier sentiment. Dolly was quiet for a moment then. "Were you afraid when the shelter collapsed?" Malcolm considered the question seriously. "Not for myself," he answered honestly. "For you, for the others." "I wasn't afraid," Dolly said, a note of surprise in her voice, as if she had just realized this herself. "I felt protected, like nothing could harm us as long as we stayed together." Malcolm smiled, touched by her faith. "You should rest now. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Dolly nodded, rising to join the others. But before she left, she leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on Malcolm's cheek, a gesture so unexpected, so reminiscent of Iana, that for a moment he couldn't breathe past the tightness in his chest. "Good night," she whispered, then moved away, leaving Malcolm with the warm imprint of her trust and the weight of all he stood to lose if he failed to protect her. The hours of his watch passed slowly. The storm continued unabated outside, its fury occasionally penetrating their sanctuary when the wind shifted to directly face the narrow entrance. The small candle burned down to nothing, leaving Malcolm in near total darkness, with only the faint phosphorescence of the pool at the back of the cave providing any light at all. In that darkness, with only the storm's voice and the steady drip of water for company, Malcolm found his hand moving to the carved wooden disc Ruby had given him, Ayana's creation, her legacy of water knowledge. He traced the symbols with his fingertips, wondering what secrets they contained, what purpose Ayana had intended when she arranged for him to receive it. He was still pondering this when a sound at the cave entrance froze him in place. Not the howl of wind or the patter of snow, but something else, something deliberate. Malcolm reached for his rifle, moving silently into position beside the narrow opening. Outside, the storm had lessened somewhat, allowing faint moonlight to penetrate the clouds. In that dim illumination, a figure was visible, approaching the cave entrance with slow, careful movements. Malcolm raised his rifle finger on the trigger, ready to defend their sanctuary. But as the figure drew closer, he recognized the distinctive silhouette. Mickey had returned. He lowered his weapon immediately. "Here," he called softly. "The entrance is here." Mickey turned toward his voice, finding the narrow crevice and slipping through with practiced ease. When she emerged into the cave, Malcolm was struck by her appearance. She seemed utterly untouched by the storm, her clothing dry, her face serene. "Blackwood?" he asked immediately. "Buried," Mickey replied simply. "For now." His men scattered, lost in the storm. Some may have perished. There was no satisfaction in her voice, merely statement of fact. Malcolm wanted to ask how she had accomplished this, how she had escaped the shelter's collapse, how she had found them in the blinding snowstorm. But something in her expression discouraged such questions. Instead, he asked, "Are you injured? Do you need anything?" Mickey shook her head. "I am well. The water sustained me." Again, that mysterious reference to water as a living, conscious force. Malcolm was beginning to understand that for Mickey, it was exactly that. Not merely a physical element, but a spiritual entity with which she communed in ways he could not comprehend. "You should rest," he suggested. "The others are sleeping." Ruby took your absence. Calmly. A small smile touched Mickey's lips. "Ruby understands my path. As do I understand hers." With that cryptic statement, she moved past him to join the sleeping women, finding a place near Istas as if guided by instinct, even in the near darkness. Within moments, her breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, leaving Malcolm alone with his questions once more. When Pahana came to relieve him some hours later, the storm had finally begun to abate. The howling wind had subsided to an occasional gust, the driving snow reduced to gentle flakes drifting past the cave entrance. "Mickey has returned," Malcolm informed her as they exchanged positions. Pahana nodded, unsurprised. Of course, the water would not let her stray far from her purpose. Malcolm was too tired to seek clarification. He found a spot near Dolly and stretched out, his body aching from the day's exertions. Despite his racing mind, exhaustion claimed him, quickly pulling him into a deep, dreamless sleep. He woke to the sound of quiet conversation. Daylight filtered through the narrow cave entrance, casting a pale beam across the sandy floor. The women were already up, gathered around a small fire that someone had kindled in a shallow depression near the center of the cave. Malcolm sat up, surprised by the fire. "Is that safe?" Ruby glanced over at him. "The storm has passed. The smoke follows air currents up through cracks in the ceiling." We needed warmth and hot food. Indeed, a small pot was suspended over the flames, something aromatic simmering inside. Malcolm's stomach growled in response. It had been too long since they had had a proper meal. He joined them at the fire, noting that everyone seemed rested and in better spirits than the previous evening. Even Ruby's injured arm appeared to be healing well under Istas's care. Mickey sat slightly apart, her attention focused on the pool at the back of the cave. She seemed to be listening to something, her head tilted in that characteristic way Malcolm had observed before. "What's she doing?" he asked Ruby quietly. "Communing," Ruby replied. "The water here is ancient with many memories. It speaks to those who know how to listen." Malcolm accepted this explanation, having learned that questioning the spiritual practices of his companions led only to cryptic responses or polite dismissal. Pahana ladled a portion of the stew into a cup for him, some kind of broth with wild onions and bits of jerky softened by long simmering. It was simple but nourishing, warming him from the inside out. As they ate, Ruby outlined their situation. "We're close to the territorial border now, perhaps half a day's journey if the snow doesn't slow us too much. Once across, we'll be beyond the immediate reach of territorial law." "But not beyond Blackwood's reach," Malcolm pointed out. "He operates with federal authority." Ruby nodded grimly. "True, but his resources will be stretched thinner there. his support less certain. "Where exactly are we headed?" Malcolm asked, though he expected another vague response. To his surprise, Ruby answered directly. "There's a valley 3 days beyond the border, hidden from most maps known only to certain Apache bands. A place of ancient power where the water flows from the earth in abundance. A sanctuary," Pahana added, "for those who carry the old knowledge." Malcolm glanced at Mickey, still communing with the pool. "Is that where Mickey learned her abilities?" "She was born with the gift," Istis explained. "But yes, it was there she was trained to use it properly, to speak with the water spirits to find the hidden sources. And that's what Blackwood wants," Malcolm concluded. "Not just the knowledge of where water can be found, but access to the source of that knowledge." Ruby's expression hardened. "He will never find it. The valley reveals itself only to those worthy of its gifts." Like the disappearing spring, Malcolm thought, another place that appeared and vanished according to some criteria he couldn't understand. "What about Dolly?" he asked, lowering his voice further. "Where does she fit into all this?" Ruby exchanged glances with Pahana before answering. "Dolly carries the potential for the gift. Whether it will manifest fully, only time will tell." This was new information, and it made a terrible kind of sense. If Blackwood somehow knew that Dolly might inherit Mickey's abilities, it explained his specific interest in the girl. It wasn't just her connection to Malcolm that made her valuable. It was her possible future as a waterfinder. The realization chilled him more deeply than the mountain cold. Blackwood would never stop hunting them now, not with such a prize at stake. As if sensing the direction of his thoughts, Ruby said, "We must reach the valley before Blackwood can regroup. It's our only chance for true safety." Malcolm nodded agreement. "How soon can we move out?" "As soon as Mickey completes her communion," Ruby replied. "She's seeking guidance for our journey." They didn't have to wait long. Minutes later, Mickey rose from her position by the pool and rejoined the group, her expression serene but determined. "The water has shown me the path," she announced, "and warned of dangers ahead. Blackwood lives. He is injured but pursuing, still driven by obsession and fear." "Fear of what?" Malcolm asked. "Of failure, of the drought that comes." Mickey's dark eyes seemed to look through him rather than at him. "The territories face a dry season unlike any in living memory. Without new water sources, many will perish. Livestock, crops, perhaps entire settlements. Blackwood knows this. It is why he hunts us with such determination." The implications were staggering. If Mickey was right and Malcolm had no reason to doubt her, then Blackwood's pursuit wasn't merely about control or power. It was about survival on a territorial scale. "All the more reason we must reach the valley," Ruby said firmly. "Gather your things. We leave immediately." They packed quickly, erasing all signs of their presence from the cave. Malcolm took one last look at the ancient pictographs, wondering who had created them and what stories they told. Like so much else in this journey, they remained a mystery he might never fully understand. Outside, the world had been transformed by the storm. Snow lay deep on every surface, sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind. The sky was clear, a perfect blue, unmarred by clouds, the sun dazzling as it reflected off the pristine white landscape. Mickey took the lead, moving with confidence despite the lack of visible trail. Ruby followed, then Dolly, with Malcolm, Pahana, and Istis bringing up the rear. Their progress was slow at first, the deep snow making each step an effort, but as they descended further into the canyon, conditions improved. By midday, they had reached the canyon floor where the river flowed swift and dark between snow-covered banks. Here, Mickey directed them to follow the water downstream, explaining that it would lead them to a pass through the final mountain range, separating them from the territorial border. They walked in silence for the most part, conserving energy, each lost in private thoughts. Malcolm found himself increasingly aware of Dolly's movements, her voice when she occasionally spoke to Ruby or Mickey, the determined set of her shoulders as she pushed through difficult terrain. Pride swelled in him, mingled with a fierce protectiveness he had never experienced before. Late in the afternoon, they reached the pass Mickey had promised, a natural gap in the mountains where the river had cut through eons of rock to create a passage. Here, the canyon narrowed dramatically, the walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, the water churning through a series of rapids and small falls. "We'll camp here tonight," Ruby decided, indicating a small clearing on the river's edge, partially sheltered by overhanging rock. "Cross the border at first light tomorrow." As they established their camp, Malcolm noticed Mickey examining the cliff face opposite their position. She seemed troubled, her usual serenity replaced by a frown of concentration. "What is it?" he asked, approaching her. "Something is wrong with the water," she replied, still studying the cliff. "It speaks of disruption, of barriers where none should exist." Malcolm followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual, just stone and ice and the constant flow of the river. What kind of barriers? Instead of answering directly, Mickey waded into the shallows at the river's edge, heedless of the freezing temperature. She knelt, placing both hands on the surface of the water, closing her eyes in that now familiar posture of communion. The others had noticed her actions and gathered at the shoreline watching in respectful silence. After several minutes, Mickey rose, water streaming from her skirts as she returned to them. "The river is blocked ahead," she announced. "Not naturally. Stone and wood have been placed to dam its flow to create a reservoir." "Blackwood," Ruby said, her voice hard. "He's damming the river to control the water flow into the lower valleys." Malcolm considered this. If he controls the water source, he controls everything downstream. Settlements, farms, ranches. "Precisely," Pahana confirmed grimly. "Water is power in this land." "But how did he know about this river?" Malcolm asked. "It's unmarked on any map I've seen." Ruby's expression was grim. "That's what I fear. Someone with knowledge of the old ways has been helping him. Someone who understands the water paths, but has chosen to betray that understanding for personal gain." The implications were disturbing. If Blackwood had indeed found an Apache collaborator with knowledge of sacred water sources, their task had just become exponentially more difficult. "Can we go around?" Malcolm asked, studying the narrow canyon. "Find another way across the border." Mickey shook her head. "This is the only pass for many miles. And the water," she hesitated. "The water asks us to free it." Malcolm exchanged glances with Ruby. The idea of approaching a site where Blackwood's men were actively working seemed suicidal. Yet if they turned back or attempted to find another route, they would lose precious days. Days during which Blackwood could consolidate his forces and intensify the search for them. "How far to the dam?" he asked Mickey. "Less than an hour's walk from here," she replied, "where the canyon widens briefly before narrowing again." Malcolm nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "I'll scout ahead. See what we're dealing with. How many men, what kind of structure they've built, whether there are sentries." Ruby considered this, then nodded agreement. "Be careful. If Blackwood is there himself—" "I'll keep my distance," Malcolm assured her. "Just reconnaissance for now." He checked his rifle and knife, leaving his pack behind, to allow for quieter, more agile movement. Dolly watched him prepare with evident concern. "You'll come back?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Malcolm knelt to meet her eyes. "I promise." It was a vow he intended to keep at any cost. He squeezed her shoulder gently, then set off downstream, following the river's course through the deepening shadows of late afternoon. As Mickey had predicted, the canyon widened after about 45 minutes of careful travel. Malcolm slowed his pace, approaching the final bend with extreme caution. He found a vantage point among tumbled boulders on the canyon's edge and settled in to observe. What he saw confirmed their fears. A dam had indeed been constructed across the narrowest part of the canyon, creating a growing reservoir behind it. The structure was crude but effective. Logs and stone, piled to a height of perhaps 15 feet, reinforced with earth on the upstream side. Water seeped through in places, but the main flow had been reduced to a trickle downstream. More concerning were the men. Malcolm counted 8 of them working to reinforce the dam or standing guard around a small camp established on the canyon floor. They wore a mix of civilian and military clothing, suggesting they weren't regular army, but some kind of private force employed by Blackwood. Of the colonel himself, there was no sign. Either he was absent or perhaps inside one of the 2 canvas tents pitched beside the dam. Malcolm studied the situation carefully, noting guard positions, routines, weapons. The men appeared alert, but not particularly disciplined, more like hired guns than trained soldiers. Their attention was focused primarily on the dam itself and the trail leading downstream, rather than the approaches from above. That might provide an advantage, Malcolm thought. If they could somehow access the canyon rim, they might be able to bypass the dam entirely by climbing down on the far side. He was about to retreat when movement near the larger tent caught his attention. A man emerged, tall, distinguished despite his wilderness attire, his left arm in an improvised sling. Colonel Blackwood had indeed survived the shelter's collapse, though not without injury. The colonel spoke to several of the workers, gesturing toward the dam with his good arm. Even at this distance, Malcolm could see the intensity in his bearing, the force of will that drove those around him. With Blackwood present, the situation was even more dangerous than anticipated. Malcolm had seen enough. He backed away from his observation point and began the return journey to their camp, moving as quickly as stealth allowed. Dusk was falling by the time he rejoined the others. They gathered around as he reported what he had seen. The dam, the armed men, Blackwood's presence. 8 men plus Blackwood, Ruby mused. Poor odds for a direct confrontation. "We don't need to confront them directly," Malcolm replied. "I think we can bypass the dam entirely. There's a route along the canyon rim that would allow us to circle around their position and descend on the far side. Mickey shook her head firmly. The water must be freed. That dam is an abomination, a violation of the river's spirit. If we leave it intact, the consequences will extend far beyond our journey. Malcolm understood her conviction, but had to consider the practical realities. Freeing the water means engaging with armed men who want to capture or kill us. The risk is too great, especially with Dolly to protect. Perhaps there's another way, Istis suggested quietly. Everyone turned to her surprised. She rarely offered opinions in their strategy discussions. A way to free the water without direct confrontation. What do you suggest? Ruby asked. Istis looked to Mickey. The water itself wishes to be free. Perhaps it only needs encouragement. Understanding dawned on Mickey's face. Yes, with the right communion, the right offering, the water could break its own bonds. Malcolm wasn't entirely comfortable with this mystical approach, but he had seen enough inexplicable events on their journey to keep an open mind. What would this encouragement involve? A ritual, Mickey explained, performed at the water's edge upstream from the dam. I would need help, another with the gift even if untrained. All eyes turned to Dolly. No, Malcolm said immediately. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous to bring her anywhere near Blackwood. Ruby placed a restraining hand on his arm. Hear them out, Malcolm. This may be our best option. Reluctantly, he fell silent, though everything in him rebelled against the idea of placing Dolly in such proximity to danger. Mickey approached Dolly, kneeling to meet her at eye level. You feel the water sometimes, don't you? Hear its voice when others cannot. Dolly glanced uncertainly at Ruby, then nodded. Sometimes, when it's quiet, when I listen very hard. That is the beginning of the gift, Mickey said gently. With your help, I believe we can ask the water to free itself from the unnatural barriers that contain it. How? Dolly asked, curiosity overcoming apprehension. We would approach under cover of darkness, Mickey explained. Find a place where we can touch the water directly upstream from the dam, but far enough away to remain undetected. Then we would perform the ritual together, a communion and offering a request. Malcolm couldn't contain his skepticism. And then what? The dam magically collapses. Mickey regarded him with patient understanding. Not magic, Malcolm. Connection. The water has power of its own. Force, pressure, weight. The dam already leaks in places. With proper encouragement, those leaks could become breaches. The water would do the rest. It sounded far-fetched, but then again, so had the disappearing spring in the storm that had apparently scattered Blackwood's men. Malcolm looked to Ruby, trying to gauge her opinion. I believe it could work, she said, reading his unspoken question. I've seen Mickey's abilities before. With Dolly's untrained but natural gift added to her own, the effect could be powerful. Malcolm still hesitated. And if it doesn't work, if they're discovered? That's where you come in, Ruby replied. Yumi Pahana Istis. We position ourselves as guards ready to create a diversion or provide covering fire if necessary. We get them out at the first sign of trouble. It was still a risk, a terrible risk to take with his daughter's safety. But as Malcolm considered the alternatives, he realized they had few other options. Attempting to scale the canyon walls in darkness carried its own dangers. Waiting for Blackwood and his men to move on wasn't feasible. The colonel's obsession would keep him fixed to this position indefinitely. Dolly's choice matters here, he said, finally turning to the girl. No one will force you to do this. If you're afraid or uncertain, we'll find another way. Dolly straightened her young face, solemn with the weight of decision. I want to help, she said firmly. Mickey has protected us. The water has protected us. Now it's my turn to do something. Pride and fear warred in Malcolm's chest. He recognized Ayana's courage in Dolly's stance, her willingness to face danger for something she believed in. How could he deny her the chance to claim her heritage, to discover the full extent of her abilities? Very well, he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. But we plan this carefully. No unnecessary risks. They spent the next hour detailing the operation. Approach routes, signals, contingency plans if things went wrong. Mickey described the ritual she and Dolly would perform while Ruby, Pahana, and Istis established their positions as guards and lookouts. Malcolm would take the most forward position closest to the dam, where he could provide immediate covering fire if they were discovered. It was the most dangerous post, but he insisted. If anyone was to face the brunt of Blackwood's forces, it would be him. As darkness fell completely, they prepared to move out. Malcolm checked his weapons one final time, then knelt before Dolly. Remember, he said softly, at the first sign of trouble you run. Don't wait for anyone. Don't try to help. Just run back the way we came. Ruby will find you. Dolly nodded solemnly. I understand. And Dolly, Malcolm hesitated, then continued. I'm proud of you. Your mother would be proud too. Something flickered in Dolly's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or simply appreciation of the sentiment. She impulsively threw her arms around Malcolm's neck, a brief, fierce hug that said more than words could have. Then they were moving five shadows slipping down the canyon toward the dam and the men who guarded it. The night was clear and cold stars blazing overhead, a quarter moon providing just enough light to navigate by without risking torches or lanterns. They approached from above using the canyon rim, as Ruby had suggested, staying well back from the edge to avoid being silhouetted against the night sky. When they reached a position approximately 100 yards upstream from the dam, Mickey signaled for them to descend to the water's edge. The climb down was treacherous, loose shale and ice-covered rock threatening to send them tumbling with each step. Malcolm went first, testing each foothold before gesturing for the others to follow. Dolly came next, then Mickey with Ruby, Pahana, and Estes maintaining positions along the rim as lookouts. At the water's edge, Malcolm could see the dam more clearly, a dark mass against the starlit canyon beyond. Lights from the workers' camp flickered, voices occasionally carrying on the still night air. The guards were still alert, but their attention remained focused downstream, not up. Mickey led Dolly to a small inlet where the reservoir lapped against the canyon wall. Here they could access the water without being visible from the dam or camp. Malcolm took position behind a large boulder 20 yards closer to the dam, rifle ready, every sense alert for any sign they had been detected. What followed next was unlike anything Malcolm had witnessed before. Mickey and Dolly knelt by the water's edge, hands joined, their free hands touching the surface of the reservoir. Mickey began to sing, not loudly but in a steady rhythmic chant that seemed to resonate with the very rocks around them. The language was ancient Apache, older than any dialect Malcolm had learned. He caught fragments of meaning, references to water spirits, to the eternal flow, to the power that carves canyons and nurtures life. Dolly joined in hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as Mickey guided her through the ritual. As they sang, Malcolm noticed something strange happening to the water surface. Though there was no wind, ripples began to form around their hands, spreading outward in concentric circles that grew larger and more pronounced with each verse of the chant. The reservoir itself seemed to develop a current, water moving with increasing speed toward the dam. The ripples became waves, small at first, then larger, slapping against the canyon walls with unnatural force. From his position, Malcolm could see guards at the dam noticing the disturbance, pointing toward the water, their postures alert with sudden concern. One man shouted something, his words lost in the growing sound of water striking stone. Then, with a crack that echoed through the canyon like a rifle shot, a breach appeared in the dam, a small gap near the bottom where water began to spray through with tremendous force. The guards rushed toward it, shouting for assistance. Mickey and Dolly continued their chant, unaware or unconcerned by the commotion at the dam. The breach widened visibly, logs, shifting stones dislodging as the water forced its way through with ever-increasing power. A second breach appeared higher up, then a third. The entire structure began to groan and shift as its integrity failed. Workers scrambled to reinforce it, passing sandbags in a desperate chain, but their efforts were clearly futile against the water's determined assault. Malcolm spotted Blackwood emerging from his tent, shouting orders, gesturing wildly with his good arm. The colonel's face was visible in the lamplight, a mask of fury and disbelief as he watched his project literally coming apart before his eyes. It was time to go. Malcolm signaled to Mickey, indicating they needed to retreat immediately. She nodded, helping Dolly to her feet, their ritual complete. The water would do the rest. They began climbing back up to the canyon rim, moving as quickly as caution allowed. Behind them, the sounds of impending disaster grew louder. The cracking of timber, the rumble of shifting stone, the increasingly frantic shouts of men. Just as they reached the top, a tremendous roar filled the canyon. Malcolm turned to see the dam collapse completely, the released water surging forward in a massive wave that swept away tense equipment and would have claimed the men too if they hadn't scrambled to higher ground moments before. Blackwood stood on a rocky outcrop, watching in impotent rage as his creation was destroyed. Then, as if sensing their presence, he turned and looked directly at the spot where Malcolm and the others had just disappeared over the rim. Even across that distance, Malcolm felt the force of Blackwood's hatred, a promise that this was not over, that he would pursue them to the ends of the earth if necessary. "We need to move," he urged the others. "Fast. They'll be coming for us as soon as they regroup." They ran along the canyon rim, following it downstream beyond the former dam, then descended where the walls lowered and became navigable. By the time they reached the canyon floor on the far side, they had put nearly a mile between themselves and Blackwood's devastated camp. The river flowed freely once more, its voice a triumphant rush in the darkness. Mickey paused briefly at its edge, touching the water in what seemed like a gesture of gratitude before rejoining the others. They continued through the night, driven by urgency and the knowledge that Blackwood would not be delayed for long. Dawn found them crossing the territorial border, leaving behind the jurisdiction where Blackwood's authority was strongest. Only then did they allow themselves a brief rest, finding shelter in a grove of pines that offered concealment from any pursuing forces. "You did it," Malcolm said to Dolly as they shared the last of their food. "You and Mickey, you freed the water." Dolly's face glowed with quiet pride, though exhaustion shadowed her eyes. "I felt it, Malcolm, the water's voice, its power, it was—" She struggled to find words. It was like being part of something ancient and alive. "That's exactly what it was," Mickey confirmed her own expression, serene despite their desperate flight. "The water remembered you recognized the gift in your blood. You have taken your first steps on a sacred path." Malcolm glanced at Ruby, wondering how she felt about this development. Her expression was complex. Pride in Dolly's accomplishment mingled with concern for what it might mean for her future. "What happens now?" Malcolm asked as they prepared to continue their journey. "When we reach this valley you mentioned—" Ruby considered her answer carefully. "Dolly will have choices to make, as will you." "What kind of choices?" "Whether to embrace her heritage fully, whether to train her gift or let it remain dormant." Ruby's eyes held his steadily. "Whether you will claim her publicly as your daughter, with all that entails." The moment had come at last, the acknowledgement of what had remained unspoken between them. Malcolm felt a weight lift from his shoulders even as a new responsibility settled in its place. "I want to claim her," he said quietly. "If she'll have me, if you'll allow it." Ruby's expression softened slightly. "It is not for me to allow or disallow. Dolly has been raised to make her own choices, to follow her own path. When the time is right, you can tell her the truth. Her response will be hers alone." It was a fair answer, more than Malcolm had hoped for. He nodded acceptance, turning his gaze toward the distant mountains, where this hidden valley supposedly lay. They traveled for 2 more days, following Mickey's guidance through increasingly unfamiliar terrain. The landscape changed subtly, the harsh, rocky slopes giving way to more vegetated hillsides, streams appearing with greater frequency, life flourishing in what should have been barren winter land. On the morning of the 3rd day, they crested a final ridge and looked down upon their destination. Malcolm caught his breath at the sight. The valley below was like something from a dream, a green jewel nestled among snow-covered peaks. A lake of startling blue occupied its center, fed by countless streams that traced silver patterns down the surrounding slopes. At the far end, a cluster of structures was visible, dwellings built in the traditional Apache style, but larger and more permanent than any Malcolm had seen before. "The Valley of Living Waters," Ruby said softly. "Home." As they began their descent, Malcolm noticed Dolly's expression. Wonder mingled with recognition, as if she were returning to a place she had always known, but never seen. Mickey moved ahead, clearly eager to reach the valley floor. Pahana and Istas followed their postures, relaxing visibly with each step toward their sanctuary. Ruby lingered with Malcolm and Dolly, her pace deliberately slow. "Once we enter the valley," she explained, "certain decisions must be made. Outsiders are rarely permitted to stay." Malcolm understood the implication. Despite all they had been through together, he was still an outsider. A white man in a sacred Apache place. "What about Dolly?" he asked. "She's half white." "Her Apache blood is what matters here," Ruby replied. "And her gift. She will be welcomed, celebrated even." They walked in silence for a time, the beauty of the valley unfolding before them with each step. Finally, Malcolm asked the question that had been building in him since they first glimpsed their destination. "Is there a place for me here, Ruby?" "Any place at all." Ruby's gaze was direct, unflinching. "That depends on you, on what you're willing to become, to learn to accept. The valley judges each heart on its own merits." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a rejection either. Malcolm would have to earn his place, prove himself worthy of sharing in this sanctuary. The challenge was daunting, but not insurmountable. As they neared the valley floor, Dolly slipped her hand into Malcolm's, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Whatever lay ahead, whatever choices awaited them, they would face them together. Father and daughter, bound by blood and by the journey that had brought them to this place. At the valley's edge, they paused for a final moment before entering. Malcolm looked back the way they had come, toward the distant mountains, where Blackwood still hunted, where the world of conflict and conquest continued its relentless march. Then he turned toward the valley, toward Dolly, toward the future that awaited them among the living waters. It would not be easy. The path ahead held challenges he could scarcely imagine. But for the first time in 7 years, he was moving toward something rather than away. Toward family, toward purpose, toward redemption. With Dolly's hand warm in his, Malcolm Sullivan took his first step into the valley, leaving behind the graves of memory and walking into the light of a new beginning. The end.